Oh, just, yeah, right click there. That's the latest one?
Mm-hmm. There, I put a spot on it.
Whatever.
Yes, exactly.
All right.
Wow.
Okay. So, all right. So send me that link real quick. You focus on what you're doing.
I am waiting.
Yeah.
You take care.
All right. I think we're good.
Good.
We'll get started in a moment.
Until then, Matt will dance for us. It'll be great.
Can I have some music?
Yeah, great. We'll get a little music going. Get a little taps. Yeah, right. There you go. Thank you. I'm terrible at beatboxing, or else I didn't do it, but it would do that.
Well, I think after the morning session, I would be afraid it would get different pretty quickly. Oh, you're waiting on me? Okay. Okay, welcome back everyone to lunch. We have a number more speakers. I think we got 4 in this session. And so we're starting. Oh, waiting on me, huh? Okay. We're starting with Jen Lute Costella. Jen analyzes hockey with a statistics and systems-driven approach. She practiced law prior to shifting her focus, and she recently co-founded a hockey consulting firm, LCG Analytics. She's written about hockey for various media outlets, reaching national and international audiences. I'm excited to have her here.
I'm excited to be here. Let me tell you. So first of all, if you go to the website, the LCG website, you don't have to do it now. I'm just saying if you do, remember that when things are first starting, there's substance before beauty. So under construction. Anyway, so the thing I'm going to talk about is specialized tracking. And if you know me at all, or if you've followed me on Twitter or anything, you know that I've been working on this project for, I don't know, 5 million years, it feels like. But back in February, I started a project trying to figure out different ways that we could track players' skill sets. And I'm not talking about like, hey, who's really talented and who's not really talented. I'm talking about what kind of player is this? Does this player work better in a cycle type of system? Does this player work better on rush type of shots? That kind of thing. The reason this came up is because, I guess I should click some slides here. You know, we have these established principles in hockey now in analytics: shot suppression, shot generation. They're good if you do well at them, and they mean you're going to do well probably, and you'll probably get in the playoffs. But we have these kind of like, you know, things that we know to be true. One of the things that we don't have a lot of metrics for, that we don't, like, you can't just go to a website and pop up, are these transition metrics. Basically, as soon as the breakout starts, who's doing the passing, how are you getting out of your zone, how are you getting into the other zone, you know, how are you setting up your offense, that kind of thing. And so because we don't have those, we have this really two-dimensional view of how hockey works. We have shot suppression and shot generation. But we all know, I mean, I assume all of us nerds have watched a couple of games. We all know there's a lot more to hockey than just this two-dimensional look. So that's why people are doing a lot of different tracking with microstats. So we've got, you know, all sorts of stuff in this transition category, whereas the stuff in the offensive zone, the defensive zone alone are a little more limited. I mean, when you think about the transition, I kind of look at it from like the top of the face-off circle to the other top of the face-off circle, kind of that really wide swath of area. That's pretty big part of the hockey rink that we don't have a lot of stats for, that we don't have a lot of measures for. So one of the things that a lot of really smart people have been doing is trying to find ways to strip away team effects, strip away, you know, how a coach uses a player to look at what they're really capable of. And sometimes when you see those metrics, you go, how can my favorite player, who is so exciting and scores so many goals, be this much garbage when it comes to driving possession? And, you know, it's like kind of hard to reconcile sometimes, because you think, Matt Duchene is this really exciting player, and like every time he gets a breakaway, everybody's standing out of their seats, or they're going, oh God, please no, if it's against their goalie, because they know he's going to score. And how can he be that bad when it comes to all these possession metrics? Is it just that he's, you know, riding the coattails of everyone around him? Or is there a way that these players have value or have skills that we don't measure very well with shot metrics? Or are there ways that players are skilled that actually are kind of adversarial to having very good shot metrics? So I started looking at it, and I tried to figure out some ways that I could figure this out, because I was really confused. So basically, I just sat down and thought of every single way I could think of at that moment to track a player, every type of thing I could think of on the ice, to see what they were good at and see what they were not so good at. You know, you hear a lot of stuff about different players, about what their skills are. Like, this guy always finds a soft spot in the coverage. Well, how do you track that? Like, how do you look at the game, and how can I tell who's actually good at that, or has just gotten a reputation for that, when, you know, because he found, you know, the backside of the open net or something a couple of times on some real big goals, and then he gets that reputation. Is that really one of his skills, or did he just kind of happen to find himself in the right place at the right time? Other skills up there, you know, puck handling, being a playmaker, creating chances, that kind of stuff. I wanted to figure out ways that we could try and track that. And so basically, this whole project that ended up having over 100 volunteers tracking and, you know, assigned to different players, this whole project basically was an experiment to figure out if there were actually ways that we could try to track this stuff. So what I thought going into it is that I would find like two main types of skilled players. The guys who were like the Kopitars of the world and the Bergerons of the world, like, hey, I'm Mr. Shot Generation and Mr. Shot Suppression, and I can do anything and I'm great. And then like the guys who have really bad possession metrics, who really aren't independent possession drivers, who were just like rush chance type of players. But really, I found kind of three main categories, and honestly, the more I'm doing analysis on it, I think there's four main categories, but let's go with the three for now, and we'll move on from there. There's the all-around guys, the Kopitars, the Bergerons, the Taves, and things like that. Then you have the do-it-yourselfers, the DIYers, I call them. That's the category that I think is going to have to be split in two, because there's really two main ways those guys do that stuff. And then there's the finishers, the guys who they're going to find a good place to be, and they're going to be open, and then they're just going to pop it into the net with a quick one-timer. There's a lot of overlap in these two. No one player is specifically this and could never score on a breakaway or something like that, at least from what we found here. And this was 72 players over 3 seasons, all the goals and assists. That seems like you're like, it's not a very big sample, and it's not. But it was a good place to start with this experiment because it's doable. It's 3 seasons worth of data that are easily found. You know, you can go onto the NHL's website and go through this player's game logs and find all the times that he scored a goal or that he had an assist at even strength, because that's all we used for this. 5-on-5, 4-on-4, 3-on-3, that kind of stuff. And then you can, you know, go back and look at it and track this stuff. I'd love to put like saves in there too. Every time the player actually had a shot that got pretty close to the net, anything like that. Maybe that's something that happens going forward, but in a retrospective type of experiment like this, it wasn't really doable. These are all the players that were in it. There'll be a quiz after this, so you better memorize their names. Basically, they're people that I picked who were pretty decent scorers. You know, a couple of them may not have been in the league that long, but I thought they were interesting, so I was like, yeah, I'll throw that guy in there. Like Jory Latira, you know, he's not got all that many points yet or anything, but I needed guys who had a lot of goals and assists, because if not, we weren't going to be tracking very much for them. So there's a whole bunch of guys. There's at least one player from every team. A couple of teams have like a whole line of players. And looking back on it now, I kind of wish I could do this for like every player in the league, because it came out to be kind of fascinating. One of the things we did was use a stopwatch to track the players from the blue line until the time the goal was scored, and that's their zone time. So not just the time of possession from the time they started their breakout, but from the blue line, from the moment it crossed the blue line until the goal was scored. And then we had possession time on the goals. So when the player had the puck on his stick right before he took the shot that scored the goal. It wasn't cumulative. So, you know, if he had the puck 4 times during some long cycle in the offensive zone, we didn't keep building and building and building, because I wanted to get an idea of how long these guys were holding the puck before they shot. So there were some repetitive type of characteristics that came out of all these goals. We ended up with 7,144 goals and assists that we reviewed during this. And then, because I'm a psychotic perfectionist, I went back and re-reviewed another 5,000 of them. 5,000 of the 7,143, actually. 7,143. The average on the breakaways from the time of hitting the blue line until you're at the goalie was under 3.5 seconds. If you take the shot a little sooner than getting to the goalie, it's a little, you know, a little shorter. If you take a little bit of a windy route or something, it's a little longer. But those are kind of the general things here. And then we had possession time. Anything that was like 4/10, 5/10 of a second was like a one-timer, a deflection. You know, you're standing in front of the net, you tip it in, something like that. Rebounds, and everybody's just shoving their sticks in there, and you know, it's everybody's best guess who actually got the goal type of thing. 0.6 to 0.8, just give a little toe drag. Maybe you move it to your forehand from your backhand because the pass wasn't exactly where you wanted it, that kind of thing. 0.9 to 1.1, wrap around, making a quick move to get free of some coverage, taking a second to aim, and then 1.2 to 1.5, you know, shaking off coverage again, but you're doing a little more. When you get in the 1.5 to like 2.0 area, you're really looking at players who are, you know, these are the guys like Hossa who cross the blue line and then they make that abrupt left turn and get to the high slot because they're like, hey, sucker, thanks for taking away the boards. I'm going to go right over here and get a shot on goal. So that takes a little bit longer. There are some players, Grabowski, who like to hold the puck for a really long time before they shoot. Like they just skate around 4 seconds or something like that, and then they take a shot and they score, and it's kind of funny actually, because everybody just stands there looking at him like, where's he going to go? What's he going to do? But it was neat to see that. One of the things I did then was try and see, is there any correlation between how long these guys have the puck in the zone and goals per 60, all even strength, of course, during the same time. It was pretty low, but there seems to be kind of a sweet spot in all of these things that kept coming up. Maybe like a really good time to be looking at. It was about 9.4 seconds. And with the player who was actually doing the shooting, holding the puck for about 1.1 seconds. So if you think about it, those are the guys that are taking one extra moment to aim or to get, you know, shake a little bit of coverage. So it kind of makes sense that that seems to be the popular time recurring again and again throughout this. What I did here is take possession time and the zone time on the goals from 2012, 2013. If you can see in the middle, there's that little red circle there. That's that sweet spot that I was talking about. And, you know, obviously this is an experiment. So there's a lot of different theories coming out of this. I have about 500 different projects I want to do now after seeing this. So bear with me here. The guys on the bottom right, like Nugent Hopkins, Henrik Sedin, those are the cycle type of players. And this is what's kind of got them into the finisher category of this. Their shots tend to be quick one-timers, something like that, deflections, things like that. But they have the puck in the zone for a long time. It shouldn't be shocking, we'll see on a slide later, these guys also have a ton of passing before they score goals and when they have assists. Far more than most of the other players in this. The guys on the top left are the guys who basically were doing everything themselves this season. And you notice Crosby's up there. He's an all-around type of guy, but one of the things I started to notice is that when these all-around type of guys maybe don't have a ton of support on their line or somebody's struggling, they just do it. They just do it on their own and they don't really need anybody else. Like, you could put like your kid's teddy bear and the concession stand guy out there, and these guys would probably have, you know, similar production numbers. Bottom right, or bottom left, excuse me, are the guys who were, you know, having a lot of breakaways, a lot of odd man rushes, but they were like the finisher guy. Basically, they were the ones making the whole play happen. They were the guys just there to shoot it at the end, like Martin St. Louis and Lucic, a couple of other guys. The guys who are kind of in this middle area between 5 and 10 in zone time, but up near the top, like Wheeler, Tarasenko, Duchesne, Nash, those guys, they've been pretty steady throughout the 3-season period that we looked at of being guys who are kind of going to do it themselves. 2013 and 14, you can kind of see a little bit of difference in where some of these guys went, and I think a lot of it has to do with who they actually had on the line with them. Did they have somebody who worked pretty well with them? Did they get all of a sudden a center who was healthy all season, who could, you know, feed them a little bit more? Like Alex Ovechkin, everybody knows that guy's got a killer one-timer. So this season in 13-14, he was able to use that a little more, as opposed to the 12-13 season where he was having to do a lot by himself. And of course, Henrik Sedin down there all by himself again, because that's where he lives, I guess. But Gus Nyquist is another one who sticks out on here. He's kind of ridiculous. If you wanted to guess about what the longest possession time of any of these forwards who were tracked ended up being, it was Gus Nyquist in that ridiculous, you know, 28.6-second dance around the Ottawa's off our defensive zone when he scored in overtime. Taves was the one kind of in the spot, the sweet spot for this season. The season before it was Grabowski when he was in Toronto, which is kind of funny. Anyway, moving on. And then he went to Washington and he ended up, you know, a little farther over, but still doing a lot on his own, kind of going around. You see him fishing out there for nice places to hang out and finally get his shot. 14-15, Henrik Sedin, poor guy, just like hangs out over there waiting for everybody. Somebody catch up, please. Forsberg actually ended up in the sweet spot during this past season, which is interesting because he's a real do-it-yourselfer type of player. So it'll be interesting to see if this is where I think there needs to be a split. It'll be interesting to see if Forsberg ends up moving over into like this more all-around category as he develops, because he seems to be able to do a lot of this stuff by himself already. Sean Monahan makes his, you know, big debut on here. He was on the last one, but he wasn't really like sticking out very well. One of the really interesting things about this that I noticed, Winnipeg, because I didn't have Brian Little in this, and I kind of wish I did now. I had Andy Ladd and Blake Wheeler in it, and they have made this like massive progression It's really strange. All their zone times have gone up, almost double to what they were. And Lad has always been kind of the one-timer type of guy, maybe throw a toe drag in there or something. But Wheeler was like just all off by himself, causing turnovers and going and scoring goals. And then he's made this progression into being a little farther down. So it'll be interesting to see as he goes forward, which of these things works out better for him. Because he was definitely one of the players that I was most surprised about that I had really underappreciated prior to this goal or prior to this project. So then I just threw a chart together of zone times on goals and zone times on assists, because I started noticing a lot of the guys who were having the higher possession times, they had pretty low zone times. So basically a lot of rushes, things like that. When they had assists, they ended up with a lot higher zone times. And I was like, why is that? I started thinking about it, and it kind of led me to getting these categories together, because these guys are extremely creative. And that's one of the reasons that they have such terrible shot metrics as I was going through this and analyzing it, because they take these ridiculous risks sometimes. You know, you've seen it where, I don't know, Duchesne, one of those guys, they'll be up toward the top of the defensive zone and they'll go for like this ridiculous poke check. You're like, what is he doing? And like 6 times it'll work, and he actually gets it away from the defenseman and maybe just knocks it away, and you know, possession changes. But sometimes he's able to scoop that up and then he's gone, just gone. And there's no catching him, and the goalie is just like, great, thanks a lot, you guys. And then he ends up scoring. The times that it doesn't work, he's left to do that little like 2-second circle around in the neutral zone and skate back into the defensive zone. Meanwhile, everybody else, the 4 guys left in there, are by themselves because he took off to go make this thing. And I'm starting to think that that's probably the main reason why these guys have such terrible shot suppression numbers, because they take a lot of risk, but it comes with a lot of reward. The do-it-yourself type of guys like Duchesne. And because they're so creative, they're really great at passing or finding some sort of ridiculous area where they can get the puck to somebody else to score. So they fit into the system a lot better that their team is using when it's on assists than when it's on their own goals, because their own goals most of the time don't fit into that system. They just don't work that way. Just some of the like kind of random guys who everybody knows, who I think pretty squarely fit into these categories. Obviously the all-around guys, but then the finisher type of guys, I was kind of surprised about Parise, although once you think about it, the guy's always in front of the net. So he's constantly just tipping shots in. But a lot of this stuff, when you started to see what their averages were, it was kind of surprising, because you realized all the stuff that you had watched them do, you had only kind of remembered the big stuff instead of the stuff they do all the time. This is some of the fun stuff that we found throughout the project. One of the things that we did while we were trying to figure out how these guys find soft areas in coverage is look for how many defensemen or how many defending players were in the zone when this guy scored, how many players were between him and the goalie when this guy scored. Because if you're always getting to open areas, there should be 0 a lot. And that did happen a lot, but I think that measure is really subjective at this point, and I think it'll get a lot better as a metric to kind of find this skill set with these guys once we have like GPS tracking, things like that. Because, you know, say me and Jess are sitting down to, you know, track a bunch of goals, and we say, okay, there's 5 guys in the zone. This guy gets a little bit free, but there's still 1 man covering him, and I mark it as 1. But she notices that at the last second, somebody else tries to move over, and she marks it as 2. Where I was like, he wasn't there when he was about to take the shot. Like, there's a lot of subjectivity in having humans make that decision. So there needs to be like really rigid rules, I think, on some of these things. But like I said, this was an experiment, and I just wanted to see if it would work, and it seems to have worked somewhat. But some of the neat stuff we got out of this was highest number of passes prior to a goal. There were 16 for several players. Kyle Turris, Eric Stahl, Matt Duchesne, and Taylor Hall all had goals or assists on these really ridiculously long zone times. But really none of them were well represented by that happening. So it's another one of those things that proved again that just looking at goals and assists, because there's some luck built into these kind of things, you know, some days you get the bounce, some days you don't, that getting a much bigger sampling of what these players were doing when they have saves made on them, that kind of thing, even when they're just attempting shots, would probably be a good idea and give us much better, you know, sample size, so we don't get these little skews in the data. The highest zone time was 2 minutes, 26 seconds, Tampa Bay versus New York back in 2014, when Tyler Johnson, I think it is an assist on that one. And then Andy Ladd had a goal that was 1 minute and 26 seconds that they were in the zone when this happened. You know, it's really odd, another thing that we started seeing out of this, Colorado tries to do this a lot. They have a lot of really long zone times where they're in the zone for like 38 seconds, 42 seconds, stuff like that. But all they're doing is passing for the longest time. And then they generate like 2 shots and they go on and don't really score a lot. That's one of the things that I was kind of bringing up recently in a post that I did about puck possession and how it's kind of a misnomer. Teams like Colorado that are spending long amounts of time just passing around the perimeter, you know, great, you've got the puck and you're not giving up shots against right then, but you're also not really doing anything to help yourselves. Vancouver, when they have Henrik and Daniel on the ice and they're cycling like that, they'll get 8 or 9 shots in sometimes on some of these things. I mean, it's ridiculously long. Or they're generating at least like 4 shots during this time. So they're generating a lot more shots while they're doing this cycle. And I think that's kind of the thing that was telling about the systems and how they're affecting the players, and about whether or not these players really fit in that system or not. Because frankly, I think Gabe Landeskog is probably a lot more of an all-around guy than just like a finisher type of guy who's there to get the one-timer. But the system that he's played in, with this long cycles and all this passing and stuff, kind of takes away what he's actually really talented at. And so he just has to work within it. Some of the other players that I think have that type of ability, but it seems like their system doesn't really play to them, so they have to make things up, are the do-it-yourself type of guys who cause turnovers in the offensive zone. And this is where I think I need to split that category. We've got guys who are creating lots of turnovers in the defensive zone and the neutral zone, like Nyquist and Evander Kane and other guys like this. And then they take it in and they score on the breakaway. Guys like Nick Bukestad, he's a do-it-yourselfer type of player, but he's doing it in the offensive zone. Often with like Scotty Upshall or somebody like that, causing a turnover, getting him a quick pass, and then he skates around, you know, 4 guys, gets over to the high slot or the low slot and takes a shot. So I think some of these systems are playing to what they think would be a good possession model, but it doesn't actually match what some of these guys are really actually good at. And so that's what I'm trying to look at through this, and I'm going to do a bunch of posts on this and everything, because there's no way I can talk about, you know, 3 years of 72 different players and get everything into it right now. But there were some interesting things that I found about some players that I thought you might like to hear, because it's way more fun than just listening to me talk about, you know, theories on different things. Thomas Vanek, 81% of the goals that he scored, I don't know why that S is there, by the way. Oh, I guess this is supposed to be for St. Louis, sorry. I was thinking padding, I guess. 81% of his goals have been in like the one-timer category. St. Louis was second with 75%, whereas Ryan Johansson and Skinner from Carolina, they rarely score goals like that. Kind of interesting to think of, because both of them where all 4 of those players are known as being offensively gifted, and yet they score goals in completely different situations and completely different manners. The next one where you're going to get like a toe drag or something, or just a quick move to aim a little better. Goudreau and Henrik Sedin, he comes up a lot in this. We're both there, but Tyler Johnson and Max Pacioretty, they don't do that, ever. The next one where you're making a little bit more of a move, trying to get free of coverage. Joe Thornton was there. Nyquist, Eric Stahl, Tavares, and Goudreau were all pretty high there. And part of the thing with these, I don't know, these times are things that as I went through all this stuff, I noticed these things were similar. Since I did, rewatch 5,000 of these and was looking for specific things, I started to get a sense of like what was happening, during these specific times. So I put these kind of artificial brackets around these times. Obviously, when you're looking at it as a whole, you want to kind of give it a little more fluidity. But I thought it would be easier to present in a manner with these times kind of bracketed out. So it's interesting to note that this quick move, the 0.9 to 1.1, some of the guys that you would expect to see there have no goals scored that whole time in those areas. Like, you tend to think of like Hank Zetterberg as a guy who's pretty crafty, who can find some open areas and stuff, but he's not holding the puck when he does it. It's just a little bit weird. Like, it starts to recalibrate how you think of all of these players. Let's see, who do we have next? 1.2 to 1.5. Latera and Kessler were both really high on there. Obviously, Latera's percentage is a little different because he's a brand new player in the league, so he doesn't have as many goals as everybody else. But Ryan Kessler was in there in that area where he's basically trying to, get to the slot or get to a better position in order to take a better shot. But once again, we have all of these guys who are either one-timer type of players or, Evander Kane, who doesn't have time to do a 1.2 or a 1.5, second possession. He only has time for like the 3.0 because he's taken it all the way to the house. He's not going to mess around and pass it. So, and why would you? If I was Evander Kane, I wouldn't either. Actually, I'd do a lot of cool stuff if I was Evander Kane, but that's totally beside the point. Let's see, 1.6 to 2.0. Giroux is there, and that's not a big shock because he's got Voracek with him, who will skate the puck in, take a couple of strides, make a great pass. Giroux finishes it off. It's, this beautiful partnership between the two of them. Matt's just going to walk out now. He's sick of my presentation. It's like, get over it, lady. Let's go. Kind of interesting, Henrique being on there in that 1.6 to 2.0. Probably because the Devils really need to work on getting somebody who's a little more dynamic in terms of being a puck carrier to play with Adam Henrique, because he's got the skill set for it. Just nobody's there to like pass it to him or really, lead the rush with him very often. 2.0 to 4.0. This is like Rick Nash. Like that. That's what this whole thing should just be titled. Rick Nash will burn you so bad. I was, I watched him a lot, and I thought he was a good player. I thought it was kind of dumb that he takes so much heat for being a streaky scorer, since everybody's kind of a streaky scorer. But that guy can fly. He had the lowest times getting from the blue line directly to the goalie. Taking it all the way to the house, and in like this funny little, that elliptical, so he can get to the front of the goal. He does it. He had some of those where he did it in under 2 seconds. He's a freak. Really, he's a freak. You should go back and watch some of his goals because it's unbelievable how fast he is. Evander Kane, Crosby, particularly during that 12-13 season, and a couple of others. Gus Nyquist, of course, because that's what he does. And then the 4.0s I thought were great. The guys who held the puck for over 4 seconds, and you could honestly see the defenseman just be like, any. Like, they're just sitting there waiting, like, do something. And then Grabowski's like, okay, and he scores. And they're like, you know, you just kind of see their faces just be like, great, totally gonna get chewed out for this. But Nick Fuchsstad is starting to do similar things. He really is super patient, to the point to where the defensemen just kind of were like standing there staring at him. And he's like, if you're just gonna look, I'll take the shot, no problem. And then, you know, all the guys who don't ever score that way, because they're either too fast, like Phil Kessel, who's already at the goal by the time 4 seconds have gone around, or, you know, they've already passed it off and somebody else has scored. The highs and lows, just did some things on who's using the most passing before assists happen, before goals happen. Henrik Sedin, Artem Anisimov, which kind of follows along with a peculiar pattern that I've also started to see develop, but I think I need to do a lot more studying on. Teams that are, you can tell they're trying really hard to be better possession teams, tend to do it in the early stages of it, at least from this thing. And maybe somebody wants to go do a great study on it and I'll totally read it. They seem to do it by doing a lot of passing in the offensive zone because it seems like that's the way you have possession. And then they have like one shot for every 5 or 6 passes. When in fact, the guys who are scoring a lot and really doing a great job at shot generation are shooting a lot more than that. So I think it's one of those things where the coaching is saying, hey, let's keep it in the offensive zone. We'll just pass for a long time. And then nobody can steal it and go the other way. So maybe they're trying to make up for what they see as lacking in their defense. I don't know. But I've seen this with Columbus, with Colorado, with the Flames. They've done that somewhat. Winnipeg did that somewhat as well when they were starting into this whole, hey, we actually are going to be a good hockey club thing, which, you know, they now are getting to. The lowest, the bottom ones are the lowest, except for over the OZ passes per goal. Gus Nyquist doesn't care for your passes. He doesn't need them. Player passes per assist. Sean Monahan had a really low amount that first season that he was in, but he's actually gotten much higher than that now. And Henrik Sedin and Taylor Hall, oddly enough, made the most passes to kind of set up what was happening on their assists. Gus Nyquist doesn't need your passes or your assists. He doesn't care for that. He doesn't need them. He's going to score anyway. I was cracking up watching him because I tracked a lot of his assists and a lot of his goals, and I was like, you're just a little freak, dude. What are you doing? He's wild. And these other guys, Malkin, Skinner, Datsuk, Perry, Bukestad, they don't really care about your assists either. They'll do it for themselves. They don't really care. This is, ooh, giant table of doom. Basically, one of the other things we did, and I know this is like too much info, but it'll be on the slides and then you can look at it and think it's interesting too. And I'm going to do a post just on this, actually, because it's really fascinating. We tracked what zone the assist came from, so we could get an idea of who was, you know, getting a lot of secondary assists from the defensive zone or maybe the neutral zone, or who was really dependent on offensive zone passing. Because if you think about it, if you're like a one-timer type of guy, you're going to need some assists in the offensive zone, probably both of them. So Henrik Sedin, if you can even see that, had 100% of his assists, first assist, primary assists, on all of his goals at even strength for the past 3 seasons. 100% of those assists have come from the offensive zone. So you start to get the idea, hey, maybe this guy, you know, isn't just carrying it in on his own. It's not just a rush player. He's really working on cycling the puck. The secondary assists on Sedin's goals are 76% from the offensive zone. So you start to kind of see a pattern here. Then you have like little Gus Nyquist over here, who's only got like 55% of his goals have had an assist in the offensive zone as the primary assist. Because Gus doesn't need your assists. Keep them to yourself. 24% of his goals have had a secondary assist in the offensive zone. So the dude has only scored like 24% of his goals when there have been like 2 passes in the offensive zone. That's kind of mind-blowing. Over 3 seasons, that he didn't even have that going that whole time. And it's not like he didn't play with some pretty good players. He did, but apparently he doesn't need your assists. You can keep him. Rick Nash also does not need your assists. Max Pacioretty, Matt Duchene, you know, all these other guys, they're going to do it on their own. But so I think one of the things that this will tell us when we start to look at the zones that the passes are coming from or that the assists are coming from, kind of tells us also who has some pretty decent defensemen who can pass. Because the more of these players who are breakaway type of players with a lot of speed, a lot of stick handling, the more they have a defenseman who can actually spring them, the more they're going to score with goals, you know, with an assist coming from the defensive zone. So, you know, obviously like Taves and Patrick Kane and those guys, they get a lot of boost from having Duncan Keith and Brent Seabrook, both whom are very good passing defensemen, springing them out of the defensive zone because they're, you know, they also run a pretty nice neutral zone and they can find those little gaps in coverage to get the puck and take it in. But it was interesting to kind of see how these worked out. I've got a bunch more info on this stuff, but, you know, I don't think you want to listen to me talk for like 48 hours. Maybe you do, no? Allison said yes, but she's lying. And I paid her to do that, just to kind of boost my, you know. Corey Perry's kind of an interesting one on this one too. I think Anaheim's defense is they've gotten some young guys that are pretty good at springing them out of the defensive zone, but also because Ryan Getzlaf is an absolute beast. I mean, I'm not a Ducks fan, but I've gotten a whole new appreciation for how those guys work because they really do have a lot of dynamics in their transition. And I think that's one of the big things that we saw from this, that the really effective scorers may not score on a rush every time, but it's because of a lot of speed in transition. And I'm not talking about foot speed. I'm talking about getting out of the defensive zone quickly, which, much to my chagrin, you know, was, okay, stop, Ryan. I just want to talk all day, okay? Much to my chagrin, we didn't do zone exits when we tracked this. Terrible of me to even do that. And of course, I thought of it in like September. And I thought, I could go back through all of these and get the zone exits. And I was like, stop, stupid. Don't do that. That's dumb. Like, you're not going to rewatch like over 7,000 goals and assists because you want to get the zone exits. Then do it going forward or something. Let's see what else we have here. I just threw some extra stuff in here for you guys. Average shot distance, things like that. But this wasn't the really interesting one. This one was because Henrik Sedin, Mr. You know, one-timer guy, had the lowest or the closest distance to the goal on all the goals that he scored of all the players in this project. Once again, Mr. One-timer, Mr. Get the rebounds, tip in, deflection, that kind of thing. So that was interesting. And then, you know, just thank you, because I think there's like several people in this room who did part of the tracking. You know, Allison and Jess and Rob. Who else? Raise your hand if you're on. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's like 4 people here who were part of the project, which is really cool. Anyway, sorry if you were bitterly disappointed by the build-up and then this wasn't what you thought it was going to be, but there will be a lot of posts about it because there's just too much to put in here, and I tried to make some of it fun so you wouldn't fall asleep afterwards. And if it wasn't fun, fine, whatever. Anyway, see who makes animations.
that. Yeah, that's fun. Where's the camera? If Patrick was watching all of that she just talked about, that's the thing. That's the whole thing. It's that he goes, oh, shot quality, shot quality, shot quality. But you're not taking shots. You're just using really good players to play around the perimeter, and you're not doing anything with that possession. It's all about meaningful possession. So, okay, if you're watching, I know you are.
On that note, I'm happy to welcome Nick Mercandante. Nick is a Connecticut native, practicing attorney, who is currently general counsel for Med Options, the largest behavioral healthcare provider of its kind in the nation. His true passion, however, lies in the sport of hockey. He has over 28 years of experience playing and coaching hockey at youth, high school, junior, and college levels, and has become an active participant in the movement towards modernizing the way hockey is analyzed and played. His work can be found at Lute, Hockeygraphs, and other blogs, as well as on Twitter.
All right, hi everybody. Hi, Steve. We never met. We talk all the time. We're just a bunch of weirdos on the internet. So it's really good to be here. I'm happy to be talking to you guys. We're going to talk a little bit about goalies. So here we go. That's it. Thanks everybody. So, all right, we'll go back. So goalies are voodoo, right? Okay. Oops. Just kidding, kind of. That's kind of everything about goalies that we know. Is they're really frustrating to try to analyze, to even try to track. And so we have this huge knowledge gap because they're just frustrating. When you pull up the numbers, it's hard to find correlations from the existing statistics. When people get into the microstat tracking, the goalie knowledge tends to be a little bit cloistered, meaning, you know, folks that are former goaltenders like myself sometimes only talk to other former goaltenders and they go, oh, well, you should really hold his glove like this instead of like that, because if he holds it like that, then the puck deflects off the side. And everybody goes, well, what does that actually mean? And then we just keep going back to the same statistics over and over again, which are save percentage and goals against average. And that's pretty much it. We've made some really good advancements recently. Some guys in the room, Andrew and Sam, at War on Ice with, oh yeah, so sorry, I should go back. I updated the OSX El Capitan, and it decided that it doesn't like Microsoft Office anymore, or really likes it, I can't figure it out. So what happened was all of my slides got animations forced into them, and I can't get them out. They're like embedded in the template, like you're gonna do star swipes, whether you like it or not, just get over yourself. So now I have, you know, now I have that. So that's cool. Anyways, getting back to where I was. So adjusted save percentage, I thought was a really great leap forward. And I think that was about this time last year where that got introduced. Pulling information about distance of shots, putting it into quote unquote danger zones based on shooting percentage. That helped to, it gave us at least a baseline for saying, okay, certain goalies are facing different workloads. And that's impacting their overall numbers. So when you talk about things like save percentage, well, never mind the fact that, you know, when we're around the water cooler, proverbial, does anybody stand around a water cooler and, you know, talk like this? I don't. When you talk about save percentage, all situations obviously throws a curveball because some guys are facing more penalty kills, some guys are facing less penalty kills and have a benefit from it, or they have a great penalty kill that impacts the numbers. So pulling it back to 5-on-5 is one step. Adding in the adjustment for danger zone is another great step to try to further refine what we're actually looking at with goalies. I think the problem is that if that's our one tool, save percentage, it's just not really enough. What we're lacking as far as just talking to your average hockey fan are tools that make sense. Goals against average makes no sense whatsoever because it's impacted by everything else going on the ice. So it just makes no sense. Save percentage is good, but it's just one tool. We need tools that help compare goalies against each other, whether it be across seasons or against their contemporaries in season. It's more valuable to be able to say, well, I think this guy is performing better than this guy, and here's my proof, other than just saying, well, one has a 92.35 save percentage, the other has a 92.16, or adjusted save percentage is 93.35, and that's good, I think, because there's an average there, and I think he's better than it, I think, but I have no baseline. So that's where I came up with this statistic called adjusted goals saved above average per 60, which is a mouthful, I understand. Somebody said to me, well, you should name it Mercad 60. Don't name it Mercad 60, please. You could name it like Voodoo 60. That would work. But basically, what is it? It's a very, very simple statistic. All it does is it takes those adjusted numbers by danger zone, and it determines how many more or fewer goals allowed by the goalie in question than if a league average goalie were sitting in his place. So if a perfectly league average goalie were sitting in the place of Carey Price, let's say, would he be getting caved in, the same way as Carey Price, or put the other way around? Is Carey Price actually making more saves than that league average goalie would be making if he was on Montreal? I made it a rate stat. I think that's important just because if you don't make it a rate stat, it's accumulative. So, if you have more opportunities to play, you're going to build up more goals saved, obviously. And it also sets the league average at 0, which I think is important because that creates your baseline for comparison. If you know that 0 is average and you see somebody who's negative, you immediately, without looking at a big table or anything like that, you know that that goalie is performing worse than a league average goalie considering the shot load that he's facing, which is valuable when you're just talking hockey and you want to say like, hey, this guy kind of sucks, and here's why. Look, he's in the negative as far as goals saved above average. And then obviously the other thing that I mentioned is controlling for situation and environment. So part of the reason goalies are so tough to analyze is because they're just fraught with randomness. It's also because there's only one of them out there, and the only thing that's happening is he's getting shots, but there's all these different things that are happening in front of him that aren't recorded within that shot. So there's deflection off a skate, there's a screen, there's a puck that bounces funny, all those types of things that we can't get. But what we can do is at least control for 5-on-5, and we can get that empirical league-wide adjusted save percentage, which is pretty good. I think there's been a couple studies that have said those zones are pretty reliable, at least for a baseline. Oh, look at that. So that's just a picture of the stuff from War on Ice as far as those danger zones. I think most of the people in here are familiar with the idea. But one of the big things, and Steve Burtch has done some stuff on this, is when we got to the point of adjusted save percentage, we said, okay, well, what does it mean? Because, I'm looking at the low danger, which are the long outside shots, and everybody's pretty good. Like, everybody's like right around 97%. So, is that going to correlate or predict future performance? Or is that going to mean, what is it actually going to mean if somebody's like 97.1 one season, then he's 97.7 the next season? Is that really telling us anything for certain? So what Steve brought up was that the high danger shots are where good goalies really kind of make their bones, and you can see that there's more variation in the high danger shots as well. You can also see that there's a slight trend up, which I think is interesting, season by season. Either goalies are getting better or defenses are getting better at controlling the quality, I know, of those in-tight shots, the scoring chances. So we don't know, but I think that's something that's worth studying. So we go backwards. What happened? There we go. So that's the basic formula for adjusted goal saved above average per 60. Don't worry, you'll get it on slides. Not very interesting, but basically it's comparing that league average goalie, those percentages that we just saw on that graph, and plugging them in for each goalie as they perform on their team and seeing what the difference is. Oh my God. That actually wasn't. I put that in there. OSX did, but yeah, we did. So some of you have seen this. I wrote a couple articles about it, but this was the basic table from the chart from last season. I control for 600 plus shots because that gets you around 25 games, which I think is about the cutoff point, team to team, as far as starting goalies and backups who play a big chunk. So I'm talking like, Hank and Cam Talbot. Well, Cam Talbot is a good backup goalie who's playing a big chunk of time, regardless of injury or anything like that. So this was the table that we got out of that. And I thought it was very interesting when I did it the first time around, because it told us some things that maybe you didn't see out of save percentage or adjusted save percentage or goals against average or the mainstream media or anything like that, which were, one, Carey Price had an awesome season, but he didn't have a historic season. If you compare this across the past 10 years, and I have all that data, he's right in the range of a half goal saved per 60 minutes against his contemporaries. He's right in that range of any elite goalie in any season. They're all hitting right around 0.4, 0.5 in that territory. What I thought was interesting was Steve Mason was off the charts last season, off the charts in Philadelphia, so nobody knew because they got caved in every game. So, he's giving up a lot of goals because they're getting caved in, but the types of shots he's facing are incredibly tough. If you put a league average goalie in his shoes, it would have been an absolute atrocity of goaltending, an absolute atrocity. Oh yeah, look at all that. Okay, so it's unbelievable. This is, by the way, this is what happens in work. Things go wrong, and then you're just like, oh well, I guess I'll just do this now. I roll with it, duct tape it, whatever. So 61% above average. So all that's saying is that most of the time, one of the things that we go through with goalies is everything's pretty tightly banded together. So it's hard to tell, especially because there are only so many opportunities to play. There's only one goalie. It's hard to tell without a huge sample whether coaches are actually making good decisions about their goalies. Well, 61% of the time, as far as those goalies that hit that sweet spot of about 600 shots, coaches are making a choice about putting their goalie in, the goalie in who's doing better than league average, which is pretty good, I think. And that rate stays pretty similar across seasons. If you look at the 3-year average, it goes up a little bit. That's not surprising because a goalie who's lasted 3 years in the league is actually pretty rare. So 71% of those goalies that hit, again, I just did 1,800 shots, 600 per season. They're above average, which is good. That means your team most of the time is probably choosing the right goalie, probably. Obviously, if you're Carolina, wow. I don't know what they're seeing that everybody else doesn't already know. Cam Ward has struggled. And, there's context there. There's injuries and things like that have slowed him down. But I'm amazed that he's gotten the number of opportunities he's gotten over that span of time. It's crazy that over 3 years, he's giving up that many more goals than just any league average goalie that you would have thrown in his place. And nobody's seen it. So this kind of helps to highlight that. That's just a 10-year view of it. So what's interesting about the 10-year is you see the above average amount for, and again, this is just a kind of an arbitrary choice as far as total shots. I tried to get a good swath of guys that have played a number of seasons. So I did 3,000 shots. What's pretty interesting though is it goes down a little bit, 54%. And I think that part of the reason for that is that a lot of goalies in that sample, they hang around in the league, they bounce from team to team, they play as a backup one season, then they get 25 games because the starting goalie went down and nobody has a choice. So they make it into this sample, but still, that's a lot of goalies that have gotten 3,000 shots over the past 10 years who've been pretty damn bad. Andrew Raycroft is almost breaking the graph. Again, that's a full half goal per 60 minutes. And I know it's 5-on-5, so it's not, but that's a full half goal of 5-on-5 per 60 minutes. He's giving up more than league average. And he hung around long enough to get 3,000 shots. That's, hey, good on him. I guess, I don't know. So there's a go. I'm trying to get my animals up and my slides in general. So look, Henrik Lundqvist, I know I'm biased. I'm a Rangers guy. I'm actually a Whalers guy. The Whalers too. He is absolutely amongst his contemporaries. He's without equal. The amount of time that he's been extraordinarily above average against his contemporaries is astonishing. Because we're talking for him over 12,000 shots from 2005 to 2015, where he's been at .268. Roberto Luongo, who you guys would guess, he's a pretty consistently good goalie. Obviously, he falls in right behind him. But what I think is interesting is that St. Louis Blues great Martin Brodeur in that 10-year span, and obviously he was more on the back nine of his long career. So to be fair, it is what it is. He probably got some extra time because he is who he is, and he has that career. And I don't have the information from before that, so I can't tell you if this was a career-long trend, but I don't think it was. But he was pretty much every season from about 2007 on, he was a below-average goaltender. So he's getting a lot of starting time in that sample where he's just not performing that great. And that was for the Blues, not for the Devils. So, right, Ryan? Right. Okay, so which brings me to the next thing. This stat, the reason this stat is valuable is for a couple of reasons. Obviously, because you can easily compare goalies against each other. You can compare against average because it sets it to 0, and that's valuable. But one thing that it leaves out, one thing that all of our goalie metrics right now leave out is, well, how did they get to this number? How did they get to a 92% save percentage? Or how did they get to, for instance, a .281 goal saved above average? It's not equal for goalies, and I think that we intuitively know that. There's boom or bust type goalies. Jonathan Quick, I think, is an obvious example, and I'm going to talk about him in a second. But if I told you he either performs really well or he gets tanked, nobody would be like, no, that's not true. He's great every single night. Of course that's not. Of course. We know that. I think that we need to start looking into more, how are they getting to that number? Because it's going to, inevitably, it's going to impact how well the team performs on a nightly basis. They're getting a lot of time, but in one game they're getting a shutout, and then in the next game they're giving up a full goal or 2 goals more than an average goalie might give up in their place. For my money, I don't want the inconsistent goalie. I want the guy who's consistent and hopefully consistently above average. So I know what I'm getting myself into, and they're performing more often than not on a nightly basis, slightly better than average, and giving my team a chance to win. And you hear analysts all the time, or TV analysts mostly, they say, oh, this goalie gives my team a chance to win. Well, that's certainly true for some goalies, and Henrik Lundqvist is a perfect example. So the number that I looked at all the goalies through that entire time span. I looked at their career numbers and by-season numbers, and the number that came up for basically top 25% is 60% and above in season, and then over the course of the entire career, 60% and above is really only about 10% of the goalies. As far as in above average, it's it's exactly that. It's performing above that in-season line for an league average goalie in adjusted save percentage. Henrik Lundqvist is at 62.7, which doesn't sound extraordinarily high, but against his contemporaries, it is very, very high. I think what's also important to note about him, and it's not coming up because, I don't know, PowerPoint. What's important to note about him, and you can visually see it, is he does not spend a lot of time far south of the average line. And you'll see in a minute, some of the boom or bust goalies, they go wildly above and below often. If he's bad, he's just barely below league average bad. And so his percentage of bad starts, which I qualify as 1 goal below league average, and the reason I qualify at 1, which sounds like a lot, is because in a small in-game sample, it's harder to do a 0.5 goals because it's 30 shots, you're getting 1 goal less or 1 goal more or whatever it may be. So I'm going to study it more, but I think it's a little bit arbitrary. I'm going to work on it, but 1 goal below average, I qualify as a bad start. Henrik Lundqvist, over the span of his career, has only spent 14% of his games at that, which is astronomically low number. Like the next closest guy is, I think, 8% higher than that. So that just goes to show that all those things you hear about him, how he's just great, it's true. That's true, which is good to see. Marty Brodeur, a little bit different. 26.4% of the time he's hitting that bad start mark. 56.4% of the time he's above average though, which is pretty good. And if you know anything about Marty Brodeur, intuitively, this kind of, I think, makes sense because you see him pitch those crazy shots. You see him perform out of his mind some nights, right? Then other nights he gives up 3 goals on 18 shots, and you're kind of like, oh, okay, well, shouldn't he get yanked? But he doesn't because he's Brodeur. So 56.4% above average is actually pretty darn good. It's just that the quality of everything that's falling below that line is pretty darn bad, which puts his team in a precarious position because they just don't know what they're getting themselves into on a nightly basis. Okay, so this is all cool. It's all historical data. Yeah. Okay. It's all historical data. There's a monkey. Oh, we got animations. That's great. Okay, so what I've done with all this data is just to move things forward. I've used Marcel the monkey predictive analysis to look forward at 2016 and beyond, hopefully. And I'm still working on the basics of it, but Marcel is it's something that was popularized by Tom Tango, who's a baseball analyst. And it's a very simple predictive model. It's not doing a lot. So basically what we do was we take a sample. So I took the season prior, 400 shots, and then 2 seasons prior to that, I had also 400 shots, which isn't a lot, but it actually got me decent numbers. I got good coefficients pretty good coefficients for the season prior, and the season before that, not quite as good. And the season before that was almost insignificant. So if you know anything about goalies, they don't last. A lot of them don't last longer than 2 or 3 seasons, and that's probably why. The R squared came out to 395, which is good. They're human beings, so if it was 8, if it's 0.8, I'd be like, wow, we have robots in that. That's amazing. But there's randomness, and they're humans, and they get injured, and things happen, and you always hear about goalie mental states, so it's not surprising that it's around that. And so out of that, I determined some weights. You weight the most recent season more, 6 times. You weight the season before that 3 times. I don't know what that question mark is. These all just got added in after the fact, so thanks, PowerPoint. Then what I did was I regressed the shots to the mean. So I looked at every season. I determined about 24% was the right amount to regress the shots. That came out to 143 shots of low danger, 90 for medium, 93 for high danger in each. So after the weighted sample was determined. And then you adjust for age. Now, this was the thing that I'm still working on. So you're going to see the next slide is a monkey with a cap, because my age adjustments, I know that Tulski and a number of people have done studies on age adjustments. I'm not seeing it. It seems like a linear adjustment for goalies is the way to go. It doesn't seem like it's working that great. So I'm still working on it. I'm going to release those results. But suffice to say, they did come back with some results. And what my plan is to provide these tools to the public so that they can do a better job of analyzing, so we get away from goals against average and save percentage, and we start talking about goals saved above average, adjusted save percentage, and consistency. Ooh, this is fancy. Okay. So basically, I'm looking at creating something like a hero chart. I'll call it a voodoo chart. It shows the 3-year adjusted goal saved above average for 60. So for Jonathan Quick, it's 0.032, which is just above the average line. You can see it's bottom quartile, below average, above average, and then elite. So he's about an average goalie, which I think everybody in this room would agree with, but the general public might not. His predicted goal saved above average for next season is 0.021. He's generally trending down. His above average start rank is 51%, which is about league average. It came out to almost 50% for above average start rank. But his 3-year bad start rank is 25%, which is not good at all. And so this gives you a good picture of the goalie's performance over time, how often he's above average and below average, and what he's actually doing that's better or worse than a league average goalie. He's also starting 72% of the time, which is a lot of time to give to a league average goalie, and you're paying this guy quite a bit to basically give you something that is an inconsistent league average goalie. The Kings might want to look at this type of data and say, okay, do we need to start preparing for the next guy? Why are we giving him, who's an now aging goalie, why are we cutting his time down? So, why aren't we cutting his time down? So that's basically what it gets to. And that's it. I know I went over my time, but I just wanted to thank all the people that helped me get the stats together. Warren Ice, Hockey Graphs, Garrick, and Dominic Galamini for giving me the hero chart idea, and goalies for being completely all over the place. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Our next speaker, Jessica Schmidt. So you can find her work over at housenow.com. Anyway, Jessica got working with microstats after the shortened lockout season in 2013, by working with our Tulski to track zone entries. About 2 years ago, she started tracking zone entries and looking at the Flyers' success, or lack thereof, in transition. Jessica wanted to improve her knowledge of the game, view the game from a different perspective, and she's going to be talking to us today on evaluating defensive zone player microstats.
No.
Is it on?
Alright, that's probably the better one to do.
Alright. Hello. Did that work or no?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm probably really quick with this. I'm not much for public speaking or really speaking, so I'm gonna try to get through this as quickly as possible. So basically I got started, like I said, working with Eric Tulski, and then I started tracking zone exits a couple years ago. And I really wasn't particularly happy with the really simplistic way that we were kind of doing it. I feel like we were really missing a lot. So I decided to integrate really what I call transition data, which is really just kind of notating which zone exits are actually leading to entries. And so this is really just an ugly data set from last season. The players highlighted aren't special, they're just defensemen. So really worried. All right.
So I'm just going to talk about some changes that I plan on implementing this year to kind of help capture a lot more of what's going on in the defensive zone in terms of, which players are actually aiding to get the puck out of the zone. So last year I kind of added a pressure category to kind of really figure out how difficult a player's zone exits are. Just from watching it the prior years, I really had this perception that forwards had an easier time exiting the zone, and spoiler alert, that wasn't actually true. And actually, I started reading a book. It's called Hockey Strategies and Plays. I might be lying about that, but so what they do is they have it broken down. There's one section about really defensive zone play, and it breaks it down into different kind of pressure scenarios and situations that players will face as they attempt to exit the zone, what kind of forecheck pressure. So I really am trying to integrate that this year, and I'll talk about that later. I'm really adding primary and secondary assists to find out which players are actively involved in actually getting the puck out of the zone, who's helping their teammates, who's a detriment to their teammates. Like Grossman, for example, who I don't have to watch anymore, thank God. Sorry, Phoenix or Arizona. And initially I was treating the transition data as kind of its own separate entity, and really I think in terms, if you want to look at it, Corey touched on this, I believe. I looked at his data set the other day, and that the way that he defined a successful zone exit is one that actually led to a successful zone entry. But for me, I don't really think it's kind of the only way to go, but whatever. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about score effects and line combinations, and put a focus on defensive training. So here, one, I'm going to apologize ahead of time for my horrible MS Paint skills and also my really ugly charts. So don't judge too harshly. So really here, just breaking down the categories. So, and if you, whatever. So within that red circle is what we utilize as immediate pressure. So basically you have a player who is constant on your back, you really don't have any time to relax. Category 2 is really like a close forechecking pressure. I think in the book they use within 6 feet. So just imagine 6 feet within that green circle. And then category 3, so they only break it down into 3 categories. But for me, and from watching the Flyers last year and the way that they struggled with that lax kind of pressure in transition against teams that sat back, I think it's important to really separate between, facing a lax or checking pressure or no pressure at all. Because really you're going to find out, you're going to see which players, which defensemen are good at getting those, your passes out and really getting into a quick transition setup for something. So I just broke it down. I can't see this, so I'm going to run over here. So I just broke down their total X's based on their pressure categories from the team level, and I also did it on the player level as well. So obviously throughout the course of the game, your immediate pressure and your 6 feet pressure are really they happen, most often. I don't think it's really a surprise. And really on the player level, for me, just from watching this, so just full disclosure, these new parameters I was working with, I only got through about 30 games because games in their life kicked me out for like 3 or 4 days until they decided to let people subscribe again. And really, so with the category 2, when the player has the puck, it's really, from watching this, you really get an idea of the player's awareness on the ice, and really how good they are at reading the play around them. And like for example, he's like Nick Schultz. He'll get the puck, he'll go and retrieve the puck in the corner, or he'll have time, and he's gonna take that second to stop, look, see what's coming with him. So there were a lot of times where his exit attempts would turn into chips, when really, if he took, the half a second to look and kind of, get an idea of what his surroundings were, he would have been able to turn it and get the puck up ice, get it to his partner. And then most common exit attempts, based on the pressure category. Obviously your carries, for no pressure whatsoever. Chip and turnovers. Obviously we have a guy on the that's kind of hard to make a clean pass or carry it out. So there's actually very few players who really don't have a high chip out when they have pressure on them. And then category 2 is chip and pass again. And really this chip is, again, it's just a lot of the times it's just players just not being aware of their surroundings, and something that you can work on them with. And then carry and pass category 3, obviously. You have time to assess your surroundings, teams are sitting back. So this I just quickly wanted to throw together kind of a chart and get a look at breaking players down and how they perform. And so this, and I just wanted to give like a really quick glimpse of this. And obviously, Mark Straight's really all of his possessions or his attempts at with facing no pressure was all was facing all passes, and we're just breaking down Chunk Tourier again. These were totally random. I didn't really care who I was talking about. And then so position level, and this is kind of where. All right, so really when I use my microstats, I also kind of utilize them to look at systems as well. And for the Flyers in particular, Craig Ruby really made it a point for his defensemen that he didn't want them carrying it out of the zone. He didn't really want them beating the rush. He just wanted them to pass it up to the forwards and let the forwards do all the work, which is fine. And it's a little difficult to show in here, but in the beginning of the season, he utilized a different system than he did later in the year. So if I had gotten through a season's worth of data, we certainly would have seen a trend down. So what happened was the breakdown actually became more stagnant. There was large gaps between the forwards and the defense, and it really impacted the defensemen and their transition games. It's obviously something that they struggle with. All right. So I just took a look at score effects, which I'm not entirely sure if I actually did this correctly, because I was working with last year's data set and my spreadsheet was kind of messed up, so whatever. So I just broke it down by a score situation. And I really just wanted to look at overall attempts. I didn't really want to worry about percentages. And obviously when you're down one, they have more exit attempts. It wasn't really surprising. I'm really just blowing by this because I'm probably gonna vomit and make mistakes. And then I went to know how it affects transition. So I kind of just broke it down again. Sorry for the terrible coloring. You can't even really tell the difference, but maybe. So it was actually interesting when you think a team is kind of up to that, they're just going to sit back a little and just really let the opponent do whatever they want because they don't care anymore. But I thought it was interesting that their total attempt, their successful transition attempt actually increased with the scores now. So okay. So I was curious to know how many players were actually touching the puck when they were actually making the attempt to leave the zone. I think you'd like to think of things as, the team out there, it's a 5-man unit. Everybody does their job, but there's only so many players that are actually involved in getting the puck out of the zone. And for the most part, it was maybe, obviously, it's 1 point. For the data I got, there was like 1.71 players were actually involved. And I I tried to track opponents as well, just to kind of keep a general outlook on it. But it was really time consuming for me, and I think I would have only had like 10 games worth of data below that, which is useless. And again, I just really wanted to know which players are involved and successful at setting up their teammates or putting their teammates in a bad position, which can lead to maybe their exit attempts or not looking so great. And so I just used Lute here, and I'll actually talk about him later. So he is actually underrated in his skill set, I'd like to say. Which, I mean, I'm not going to talk about him right now. Okay. I forgot. Sorry. I wanted to, this is from last year's data actually, and full disclosure, this is actually not entirely correct. So I didn't decide to look at line pairings and line combinations and defensive pairings until about like 30 games into the season. And by that time, the forward group, the defense had some injuries, so they were really changing up combinations. The forward group was also kind of getting jumped around a lot, particularly Braden Shen would see stretches on the top line and not. So these aren't entirely accurate, but I think you could sit there and you can kind of, for me, when I was looking at this, I was able to, see and kind of isolate, which players are kind of, helping out. Are they more of a passenger? And particularly in defensive pairings, Delzado and Shen, I think that they're a pair that you can kind of separate. If you think of Luke Shen, you think of like bad defensive defenseman. And really, like he actually is a fairly good passer. And sorry, just segueing into that. He's actually a fairly good passer. It's something that I didn't appreciate or ever really noticed until I actually started tracking these microstats, and particularly the transition data. I mean, Luke Shen is not very good, and I wish he was not on my team. But I mean, we're stuck with him, and we want to utilize him the best way that we can to get the most out of him while he's still here to decide. And he's not totally terrible. I mean, not bad, but he has his uses. So it's just really kind of a way to add another layer of perspective. And, I was actually curious to see of the Flyers zone entries, how many of them were actually a product of zone exits, and about 41. And so just strictly speaking from like a zone entry perspective, because what will happen is the Flyers actually will attempt to pass the puck out of the zone, and a lot of times the defenseman or forward will actually miss the streaking player, and then they have to regroup in the neutral zone. And so it's only about like a quarter of their actual exits lead to entries, whereas about 41% of their actual exits led to entries. So it's looking at them from different angles. So if if you're kind of, you just assume, zone entries, whatever. And I totally lost my train of thought, so a flush job here. That's it. So sorry. So tracking this stuff is really time consuming, and it's also a great way to learn about the game, and you really, it really helps give you a different perspective. And if you have the time, it would be awesome if you could help Ryan out with his passion project. And if you love beautiful data visualization, please donate to Micah and his site. I think you can do a one-time donation now. Is that correct? Yes. So even if you can't contribute monthly, help a guy out. Thank you.
Then what?
As Steve gets setting up here, I just want to let you know, due to how we're kind of running a little over here, we're gonna shorten our final break. We're gonna take a much shorter break, so we can get to the final panel and make it take plenty of time to make the talks too. So after the Q&A, we'll take a very short break, just like 5 minutes or so, and then we'll come back. Okay? So
I'll probably ask the speakers to try to keep their question answers on the short side. Our next speaker is Stefan Burtch. Stephen's been working with and writing about hockey analytics since the 2004-2005 lockout, when he decided to dig into the value of future poolside star Kyle Bowwood. He has since written for Hockey Analysis, Pension Plan Puppets at SBN, NHL Numbers, Hockey Prospectus, and is one of the lead analytics writers for Sportsnet.
Yes. What's happening now? All right. Yeah. One of the advantages of finishing your slides last minute is, in the case of time, I cut like half my presentation. So most of you will appreciate the history of assists stats in the NHL, which some of you probably already are aware of, but don't worry, it's relevant to my point in the long run. So minus all the history, what I'm looking at here is passing metrics and ways we can assess the impact of passing. And Ryan invited me here to speak, and I basically have him to thank for all of the data that I made use of in this presentation. So if you think back to the past, I don't know, 20, 30 years of hockey plus, all the way back to the 1930s, all we've really had to assess passing in the NHL are assists. We can all watch a game, we can all see passes get made, we know they're important passes made on the breakout that may not ever result in a goal. And one of the issues with passing data that we have that can actually be tracked statistically is it's very limited. So, I mean, it's to the point where the NHL wasn't really clear on what a first or second assist was up until the 80s, really. They actually changed the rules in the late 30s and then went back again in 1945 because they thought the score point totals were getting too high and actually banned second assists, but then continued to record them on the score sheets. So it's kind of a weird thing, and it has been for a long time, but tracking passing in general has sort of been lacking in the NHL. So there's been some dispute in the analytics community, this goes back a while, over the value of the second assist, and a lot of work has been done. And what largely has been shown is that primary assists tend to heavily favor forwards because they often are making the final pass in the own zone, which ends up leading to a goal. Whereas when you include secondary assists, a lot of the distinctions between forwards and defensemen sort of washes out, and defensemen begin to contribute. This also carries over into special team situations where defenders get to have a bit more of an offensive impact. And again, they're considered more equal or equivalent to forwards when they're playing on the power play. So the problem here is we don't really know about passes that lead to zone entries or zone exits. There isn't much tracking of what's going on in the neutral zone unless it leads to a rush goal. So generally, things are just being unrecorded, which is where Ryan and his team of trusty minions entered the picture. And
we basically have the passing project and Corey Schneider and his crazy year plus of watching every single minute of every hockey game for the 2013-14 season for the All Three Zones project. The main reason I made use of Ryan's data is it included both the pass sender and the recipient, whereas with the All Three Zones project, it's usually about touches and not necessarily, it doesn't make it clear or explicit necessarily in the final data who passed and received the pass. So all of the passing data I made use of largely focused on shot assists. I guess Micah would say don't use the word shot attempt, but that's what I'm getting at, shot attempt assists. So Corsi assists, in other words. And also any shot attempt itself. I actually was recording those as well, and you'll see why in a second. So all of those were recorded for a variety of teams. I've been applying them to network graphs. So about 2 summers ago, I was talking to Paul Power, who's one of the lead analysts for Prozone Sports, which is a company that recently got bought by Stats LLC, I think this past off season, and they were doing tracking in football or soccer matches in Europe. And his main area of analysis is sort of dynamic systems analysis and formations in football and how passing flow and things like that are incorporated into the overall defensive scheme and offensive scheme of soccer teams. And he made the suggestion to me that I sort of was picking his brain and asked him, what areas do you think are most ripe for hockey analysis? And he said, well, is anyone doing any network analysis? And I asked him, what the hell is network analysis? And even though I do have some of it in my math background in graph theory and network analysis, I hadn't looked at it in a long time because we don't teach that very much in high school. So I had to go back and read up on it. So there's been a lot of research going on into network theory analysis in a much more recent vein than is in historical. So it relates to things like transportation networks, energy flow, things like that. But more recently, there's been a lot of research done in social settings, so things like how people interact on Twitter or social media, and neural networks, so how our brains are wired, basically. And that's where a lot of the stuff I'm applying now originated. There's actually a bunch of very talented neuroscientists who really like soccer, apparently, and decided to apply this stuff to statistics that were coming out of companies like Opta and Prozone, and they applied them to football as far back as 2010. So they were using it for things like the Soccer World Cup, Euro, and they were making these very pretty diagrams and pictures, which look like this. Now, the advantage here for soccer in comparison to hockey is you can tell by looking at the image, the positions of the players on the pitch is fixed. So you can generally tell by the number and the position of the player where they play and what their role is on the team. And you also do not have line changes, which we discussed earlier in the day. Players tend to be on the field for almost the entire game. You might have 1 or 2 substitutions during the course of the game, but generally the guy that's out there is going to get a lot of opportunities to touch the ball, pass it, and contribute one way or another. So hockey visualizations, when you attempt to make graph visualizations, and I've been making use of software called Gephi, come out looking like, oh, by the way, that's courtesy of an analysis done by a guy named J.L. Pena from University College of London. I'll credit him for that. But oh, sorry, I'll go back to this in a second. That's what a hockey visualization looks like. It's a little chaotic, and it's kind of hard to identify what the hell is happening. And the reason for that is this is all season data. It's not individual games. Okay. For some players, if you don't use multiple games of the data, there isn't enough points worth contributing because they don't play enough. The G in the middle is actually the net. So that's actually including shot data. One of the things that came out of my reading on all the football analysis stuff is that it's actually a fairly recent phenomenon that they started including shots as a final sort of throughput in their performance analysis. So yes, it's important that I move the ball effectively to my teammates, but then who's actually generating shots? So I figured there was some value in just sort of skipping ahead of that, figuring that out. We already know shots are meaningful. So I've incorporated them from the get-go in this analysis. So this is actually a network analysis of the Toronto Maple Leafs. The way this stuff works is you basically load all of your information in, and every player in the network is collected as a node. So they're an individual vertex in the system. The connecting lines that you saw on that last page are known as edges. Edges basically represent what we're talking about in terms of throughput. So be it a pass or a shot. And you can weight an individual edge between 2 nodes in the network based on things like the frequency of passing, which is what I chose to do, You can also make them directional. So you can actually indicate are the passes originating from one player to another or vice versa. And you can make them multi-directional, depending on how frequently the passes are passing back and forth. So going forward again, so again, this is the Toronto Maple Leafs. You can maybe pick out some of the key numbers in the network. The size of the circles correlates to how key or integral a player is into the network in the games they play. So for those of you that aren't Leafs fans, or who haven't been paying attention to the hockey world for the past 2 or 3 years, Phil Kessel's number 81. So you can see him up and to the right of it. The name that might surprise people being dead center in the graph, who is often picked out by Leafs haters and fans alike as a person who should be persecuted, is Jake Gardiner. And Jake Gardiner turns out to be in my presentation a lot. So you will see his name frequently in this presentation. 43, just to the lower left of 51, is Nazem Kadri, who is also often ripped as not being able to carry the job of being the top center in Toronto, despite the fact that he is also very important in this passing network. I also decided to throw in a New York-based team because I'm making a presentation in New York, and the only team I'd actually got into the trouble with analyzing from New York was the Islanders, and it's good that I picked them because of all the teams I picked, they happen to be the most effective in these measures. So if you all remember New York's season last year, they were one of the top possession teams. They scored a lot of goals. They were very effective. They ran 4 lines. They should have had a much deeper playoff run than they did. And I predicted them to win the Stanley Cup, and that didn't happen. So I feel guilty about that because people probably bet on it, and I hope they didn't bruise their shirts. Okay. So the statistical side of this is a bit more cumbersome than some of you might want to see. So I've saved you the trouble of reading through tons of dirty calculations and statistical measures, and I'm going to more verbally describe what's going on here. There's 3 major forms of measurement that you can use to analyze network data in graphs. Centrality measures for individual nodes, which indicate sort of how important or valuable a node is to the network. Clustering, which gives you a sense of the density of the network and how well connected it is. Basically, how closed is a neighborhood? In other words, how do the other nodes around a player or an individual connect, and how frequently and tightly knit are they? This relates to another concept called modularity, which basically is sort of a way of assessing, are there sort of cliques or groups within the overall network that are showing up repeatedly? And I would expect this to a certain extent in hockey, because when you take the whole team as a whole, you would expect there to be some modularity around lines and defensive pairings and things like that, which does seem to be the case. I didn't throw all the data into this presentation for the sake of brevity. Degree measures sounds complicated. It's not. It's literally just the sum total of passes or shots. So I actually haven't included that in the further analysis because it's not very complicated. But that data is very easy to obtain. You just add up all the shots or passes a player makes between them and another player. So there's a lot of different centrality measures. Most of these come from the neural network research and media research that's been done in the past few years. Closeness centrality is basically measuring the average path distance between one node, so a player, and the other nodes of the network. Basically, how far away are they from each other in terms of their closeness? And it doesn't necessarily mean actual physical distance. If you go back to the picture, it's more discussing how many different ways can I connect to the other players in the network. So average closeness is sort of saying how many different routes can I get from player A to player B, and do that on average for the entire network for one player. So this is a graph of the closeness centrality of all the Toronto Maple Leafs. So basically, the higher the score, the better. In other words, the closer a player is on average to the rest of the team. Now, I would ignore Carrick and Sill because I think the sample that we were looking at for Leafs games, this is not the entire season. So it was a portion of games, and I think Carrick and Sill did not play very much in the sample, so their data is a bit skewed. But if you look at the very top of the list, you see Jake Gardiner's name again. He shows up on the top of every list I'm looking at here. He is probably the most valuable passer the Leafs have. Leo Komarov, fairly important defensively, but right below him, Nazem Kadri, again, very important. So these are guys that played with a variety of line mates in a lot of different situations, and they made an effective passing contribution. And you have to remember, all of these are passes that ended in a shot attempt, right? This isn't necessarily clearing the zone. I'll get into that a bit more when I talk about limitations. My favorite player to talk about on Twitter and the internet space in general, Cody Franzen, is not that highly rated. You can see him further down in the middle towards Roman Polak's name, who I believe is not playing for the Leafs these days because he's not very good. So sometimes I'm wrong. That's okay. Moving forward. So the Islanders. There were some surprising names at the top of the list here. Nikolai Kulemin, who is also a favorite player of mine, so I'm okay with this. But Travis Hamonic, Brock Nelson, Thomas Hickey, John Tavares, Johnny Boychuk. The names at the top of the list in this tend to make sense. The other thing I would like to draw your attention to in this comparison, though, is if you look at the overall shape of the team as a whole, you'll notice that the New York Islanders as a unit all have a very high, relatively high degree of centrality when you compare them to the Leafs. The Leafs tails off much faster. There's a lot of guys down towards the 0.4 or lower zone on the Leafs, the bottom of their roster. Whereas again, for New York, everyone is well above 0.4. So there's a lot more balance in their lineup. It doesn't take as many passes for you to see connections between different players. All right, another measure between this centrality is a very important measure of value of a node to the network. And it gets at the idea of what happens if I remove this node from the network. How much will that affect my team's performance? So guys who rank high on this are danger points. In other words, there are sort of key nodes in the network where if they were attacked or removed from the equation, that would do damage to the ability of the network to function. So if you think about that from a targeting standpoint, if I'm defending against a team, this is a good idea to be aware of, at least because I can fixate on these players as guys who maybe break down their overall system. You'll see again for the Leafs, Jake Gardiner is the top player. Then you start seeing some weird names. And this may get back at why the Leafs aren't very good or haven't been recently. When Brandon Kozin is the third name on that list, he's currently leading the KHL in scoring, but he hardly played for the Leafs. They were using him as a fourth-line checker. Trevor Schmidt is the fourth name. Morgan Riley, we expect to see him up there. Richard Panik was pretty high on the last list too. And he got waived by the Leafs and demoted to the AHL recently. So roster construction and roster decisions, that this may be giving some insight into maybe how players should be valued. You'll notice that Tyler Bozak is right next to Corbinian and Holzer. That's kind of interesting and worth pointing out because he's led the Leafs in ice time for now, I think, including this season so far, like 4 years running. But like again, Corbinian and Holzer, Tyler Bozak. Okay, moving forward. Islanders. Again, interesting point. Sorry, Islanders. Notice how high the value is for Jake Gardiner. If you can shut him down, he's over 0.1 on this rating scale. No Islander is over 0.5. So if you can shut down Jake Gardiner offensively and even defensively and getting out of the zone and setting up shot attempts, you're probably going to do pretty good. There's no one guy on the Islanders you can key on that's totally going to shut their game down, and that's kind of by design. So again, Hamannik's up at the top, and the names we expect to see keep showing up. So Tavares, Hickey, Nelson, Kulin, Boychuk. Grabowski's right at the bottom, Jen, I'm sorry. He holds on to it for a long time. He's not setting up other people. He's taking his own shots and hanging onto it all the time to kill pineapples. So PageRank. This comes out of analysis of the internet. Internet networking. Basically, it's using recursion to assess the value of players. It's sort of like an assessment of the probability of a pass or shot within the network. So basically, what's the probability of any given node being attached to a player? So this is sort of a way of rating it. If you were using Google, this is sort of part of how they assess what the top page is when you search for something. Jake Gardiner again, Nazem Kadri, David Booth, who I believe was on a first professional tryout this year with, I think, Florida again. Phil Kessel, Morgan Riley, Roman Polak, not playing in NHL right now. So yeah, again, some interesting names, but again, key on Gardiner and Kadri, because again, they show up in the next measure. Again, for the Islanders, huge amount of balance until you get to the very bottom of their roster. There is not much distinction. If you look at the players between Matt Martin and Ryan Strome, there's almost no variation in that list. So again, you've got a very even distribution of passing. They're very much distributing the puck evenly, and you can't really key on one person in one line even to shut them down. Eigenvector centrality, the math behind this is fairly complicated. I don't entirely understand all of it. The point is, it's sort of like the earlier measure of closeness, but it gets away from the idea of modularity I mentioned earlier. So it completely ignores the grouping and the density of the network. And this is more of a central score if I base my evaluation on the entire network as a whole and how someone fits into it. This is a good assessment, as far as I can tell by eyeballing all the charts I've done, of player value from this perspective. So this is a good overall assessment. And you see the names are sort of in order you would expect. You have Gardiner followed by Kadri, followed by Riley. Booth is a bit of a surprise. Again, these were late season games. Burtch played quite well in the second half of the season under Wolejszo, so that may be part of what we're seeing here. Then Kessel, Ponick's name is high again. And at the bottom of the list, you start to see names you'd expect, like Casey Bailey, Petter Granberg, Eric Brewer, who is an amazing defenseman with 10,000 games played, deservingly so. Islanders, that balance is insane. Tavares, awesome player. They're also all very good. Like if you look at how far over they are, these scale. I tried to make the scales identical on purpose. So it goes from 0 to 1. It's normalized. So again, just to compare, versus no league hits 0.8. Look at how many Islanders do, right? So in an assessment of value of the Islanders team, this gets at some of why they're playing so well the past few years, last year in particular. Clustering coefficient gets at cleavishness, as I mentioned earlier, modularity. So this is sort of measuring how tightly connected networks are around an individual player. Basically, how effective are they and their peers in working together. So you see some weird connections here. Guys who scored lower earlier actually do very well by this metric. Daniel Winnick, for instance, no matter who he was playing with, played well with him. Joffrey Lupul, surprisingly similar, but doesn't show up well in any of the other metrics. So that kind of, to me, indicates maybe this isn't a great assessment measure for the purposes of what we're looking at in hockey. And again, the balance in the Islanders lineup is crazy. And Grabowski does really well in this one, even though he was in the bottom of one of the earlier lists. So he fits in well and meshes with who he's playing with, but so does Harry Zolnick, so I'm not sure that matters. All right, this is looking at team metrics. So this is for the entire team. What are the average clustering coefficients? How tightly knit or dense is the network? And then the average path length. Shorter paths are better. So I picked 4 teams at random of the ones I had already evaluated. And you'll notice that in both, the Islanders are the better team, and in both, Toronto are the worst team. So these seem to get at sort of a team value for these network measures. And generally speaking, I guess I've seen enough in doing this that I think it's worth continuing, and I'd like to sort of learn more about it and apply it to maybe not just this metric. It would be somewhere I would enjoy having more passing data. So that brings me sort of towards the end of this, but in all of this, the biggest limitation I see is a lack of data. More robust data, more complete data. Everything we have from passing projects from last year is pretty much, except for a couple of teams, I think, was partial season. So having full years of data would be useful. Automating the recording of this information would be extremely useful. You would have every game for every player. Broadening the scope to include passes that are made out of the D zone that don't necessarily lead to a shot, for instance. And then once you have more data and you can sort of look at it, actually assessing reliability and repeatability of the metrics that I've been talking about. And from that standpoint, once we have a better sense of value, assess what tactical applications are. I think some of them, like the betweenness centrality, if you can identify what the most valuable nodes are, that if you could sort of, the linchpins, if you could pull them out and attack them, that would be useful to look at. But that's about it. So I'd just like to thank RIT for putting this together, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. As I think many of you know, we're running pretty late. I think we'll do a couple questions, maybe questions or something now, and then let's shorten the break down to 10 minutes, and that way you can also try to grab some of the speakers and ask questions with them during them as well. So I see a couple hands. I'm going to grab a couple questions and then.
Come on, Jess. Sheesh.
Hey Steve,
Yeah.
I noticed on your axes on some of those graphs, the absolute values were 0.01 to 0.05. Is that from 0 to 1? And is there an actual difference between a 0.02 player and a 0.04 player?
Depending on the metric you were looking at, some of them, I think the last centrality measure was a probability, and it was the probability of a single pass or any individual pass coming from one player. And the thing is, because the thing with the Leafs especially is they had so many players playing for them at the end of the season that even the most frequent passes, you were still looking at only a 6 or 7% probability of that player participating in a specific play. So for that, yeah, the scales were very low. A lot of the other measures were normalized to be between 0 and 1. If you don't normalize them, they go up into the 30s. But for the sake of comparison across teams, I was normalizing them. And that was due to the data set. So basically, teams I had more games for, the numbers would get larger. Teams I had fewer games for, they would get smaller. So I just wanted to normalize for comparison.
This is a question for Nick. If this is a stupid question because I haven't properly understood exactly what you're doing, I apologize in advance. One thing that I know Micah did back when he was kind of deep in the Corsi streets was look at correlations over a range of game samples, and you found that like Corsi's like peak predictivity, I think, occurs around 20 games, something like that. Have you done that at all with adjusted goals saved above average for 60, where you look at how the repeatability scales with sample size rather than on a season over season basis?
Yeah, so I did do a little bit of that, and the in-sample, you're talking about like in-sample repeatability, how well the first half might predict the second half. Yeah, there's definitely correlation. One of the things that I'm struggling with it is season over season, because it just seems like I'm only getting like 2 or maybe 3 in some cases good years where everything correlates the way I want. And maybe it's because, like I pointed out, goalies just don't last that long. Or, you know, good goalies are rare, ones like Hank or whoever. But yeah, the in-season stuff does work, and it works best for those goalies that can get over that hump of 2 or 3 seasons. Those are the ones where it's showing a very distinct correlation.
Okay, one more quick question.
This one's kind of for all of you guys. I think it's great they clump all 4 of you together because it actually kind of makes sense with the networking as well as kind of this idea of timing players' possessions and how that leads to goals. I was just wondering, we're using it anyways. Yeah, I was just wondering if anybody thought of maybe this kind of idea of event chains, kind of something where there's almost kind of a rhythm to how goals occur in hockey, how a goalie gets over big saves, something like that.
Tempo and all that.
Yeah. No, I've totally been thinking about it. It's just a matter of having data to analyze it.
Right.
And I
just
think
wanted to
that's-
figure that was on you guys. But yeah.
I think that's one of the things that we've been trying to kind of do. I mean, I timestamp everything in my tracking, and so that way I have like this really unique play-by-play. Like I know every second that everybody did something. Now in the defensive zone, usually I have it timestamped by entry and exit. So I don't know every second that everybody touches, but you know what happened between, within this 22-second period. But I think those kind of things really do give you a better idea of how the game flows, because you start seeing like, oh, defenseman, D2 made a passing turnover right after they had gotten the puck back, and then all hell broke loose. You know what I mean? Like you start to see how those patterns develop, and like they start to create chaos in terms of defense covering the right guys and stuff. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that you start putting all this stuff together and you get some really unique things that you can do because you have an idea of time.
I mean, one thing, and you just got me thinking about it, but with goalies, you always hear this thing like certain goalies benefit from getting more shots. They play better. Is that true, or is that a myth? Do goalies perform better than what they perform like on average if they're getting fewer shots in a game or they're more spread out? Is there anything?
I would guess there's an ideal. Like there's too few or too many.
There might be.
But I think what I've been thinking about more and more the more I've been looking at it is that hockey is very much a game about time and space. And that sounds like I'm talking like Stephen Hawking, but I mean more that the time between sequences of events and this finding open space, for instance, with shooters or spacing of defenders or spacing for the goal. Like there's things we're missing that we know we need information on, and we could get a better handle on it, but we're beginning to sort of see how that stuff is playing together and making an impact.
And this isn't just I played the game thing, but it is. When I was playing as a goalie, I would feel that. I don't know if it was something that would bear out in the results, but I would feel that. Like I would feel like in certain situations where I'm getting peppered, I'm on.
You're in a rhythm, yeah.
I'm in a rhythm.
Yeah.
In some situations where I'm not getting shots, I go the first 6 minutes without a shot, and then I let in a dub. You know, so there you go. It's perfect, right over the shoulder. So, you know.
Thank you guys. We're gonna try to be quick with this, maybe by 10 after certainly. So go grab. I think there's cookies out there and coffee, I believe. So you can grab some and come back.
So like, if we had data, it's well, that's now because like yeah, it's just you can say like which is very simple. So yeah, but no, we know we have
So, well, right, yeah, I can't keep it really guys that has to do yeah, but yeah, I think and there are all lines that
All right, so starting off our final group of speakers is Jack Hahn. Jack is the video and analytics coordinator for the McGill-Martlet hockey team, working there on a part-time basis for the last 2 seasons. He also works full-time in digital media for the ATP World Tour and formerly worked in marketing and web content for the Montreal Canadiens.
I'm just gonna wait for these people to show up and make themselves comfortable. So a few more seconds. Not too comfortable. I don't want you to sleep on. So I see that there's been kind of a precedent set today about leaving the thank yous for the very end of the presentation. But I actually want to start my presentation with it because I think it really sets the tone for what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And actually, the 2 people I have in mind when I think about this, they have no idea what IT or knowledge management or even hockey is, and they can't read this because they don't know English. And I'm talking about my 2 grandfathers. My father's father just turned 86 last week, and he was an elementary teacher for about 35 years. And I think the most important thing that he taught me was, anything that's worth doing is worth doing better. He devoted his life to, reading and understanding and teaching, and the whole process of him just kind of sitting by himself, reading something and try to understand it really set the tone for me, having spent a lot of time with him growing up. My other grandfather is, I want to say he's 88, maybe a little bit more, and he had half of his stomach taken off about 15 years ago because of ulcers. And he's been living since then on a diet that's pretty much like 500 calories a day. So he weighs like 70 pounds. But I think he's one of the most happy and content people I know because he lives very simply. And I think that's what I strive for as well. I strive to live simply and also to work simply, which is the whole thesis of what I'm doing here. And actually, he just became a great grandfather for the 2nd time recently. So, I'm very envious of that, and hopefully at that age I'll have something to look forward to as well. So, the point of what I'm going to talk to you about today is, we've heard a lot from experts about how they collect data and how they analyze data, in hopes of influencing what happens on the ice. And I think there's a step between those 2 things that nobody has really attacked in the past, because you really have to work for a hockey team to understand the implications of this. And I'm talking about what happens when you have those insights and you want to transmit it to the coaches so that they do something with it.
And since I started working at McGill, the most important thing I found is I really needed to develop a strategy to not only create that knowledge or that insight, but also to store it. Because a lot of times what happened is, I write up a report or I would come up with some stats and the coach would be like, I don't want to look at this right now, or I don't think it's the right time. I mean, what I could do is I could just save on my computer, but what if I drop my computer? So I have to think about what else I can do. I can maybe email it to them, but they get 250 emails a day and I might lose it in my inbox as well. So that's not a very good idea. So really, I have to go a little bit further and try to find some tools that would help me get the job done. So the whole basis of how I do my job is what I call the 100, 10, and 1 rule. So for every 100 minutes that I work, I want the coach to take 10 minutes to try to understand it, and then he would then create a coaching message that he would give to players in 1 minute or less. And what that does is really the players concentrate on playing the game, and the coaches concentrate on teaching the game, and I try to recoup as much of that time as possible so that I can take the time and try to do my job better. And with that in mind, the tools that I've decided to use aren't the most advanced. Most of them are free. And the reason why I did that is because I like things that are simple, reliable, and flexible. And usually those are not the tools that you make yourself, but tools that other people have already made that you can adapt to your needs. And at the end of last season, I made this very comprehensive report on whether it's shot attempts, possession, deployment, everything else for the coaching staff. And one of the coaches said to me, he said, Jack, this is great, but I mean, this is all common sense. And I can see that he wasn't trying to insult me, but I mean, it came off a little bit insulting, right? When you think that you worked a month and a half and this is just common sense. But this guy has coached hockey for, I want to say 25 years. And I think this is the first time where he's gotten something in writing at the end of the year. Before that, every single season, you amass this quantity of knowledge about the game, but then you just kind of forget about it. And I think that's something that the coaches are really missing out. So it's not that numbers rule the world, because they don't, but you want to at least put things down on paper or somewhere so that you can refer back to it when 10 years down the line you have some questions. And I think that's the key here. It's knowledge management. Right? It's not necessarily statistics or analytics, or it's nothing advanced. We just want to save all these insights and knowledge that we have, because I said to a friend once, I trust my eyes, but I don't trust my memory. Because what I see today is true, but I might not remember it 5, 10, 20 years from now. And it's not about having more data, but it's just about putting some of that to good use, because in my mind, hockey is a really simple game. You have 10 guys out there trying to put the puck in the net, and then 2 guys out there trying to prevent the puck from going to the net. And then trying to make it too complicated is just taking the fun out of it. So both my parents are software developers, and you have this term called a stack. So it's just a collection of tools that you use for one specific end. First of all, data collection. So Stiva is a software that a lot of coaching staffs in pro and amateur hockey use, and essentially what it does is you film the game, it goes into your computer, and then Stiva takes care of the rest. You press some buttons, and then it gives you the goals, assists, line changes, whatever. And what I've done is I've reprogrammed that software so that at the end of every game, it gives me a printout, much like what RTSS does. And what that's allowed me to do is I can do 5 trackers work on one computer. That's pretty good, right? Because I'm all about saving time and reducing uncertainty. And the great thing about working off of Stiva directly, as opposed to just tracking things in a spreadsheet or on a sheet of paper, is that when you go to the coaches after a game, you can actually show them exactly what happened. So you can show them a zone exit, a zone entry, a shot against, a goal, anything that you can think of. So, if the coach doesn't choose to believe your numbers, at least he's going to choose to look at your video. And that's really, I think, where I got a lot of the trust from the coaching staff, is because everything I do, they can go back and double check. and that's very important. Data interpretation, I think a lot of people are a lot better at this part of the game than I am, so I'm not going to spend time on that. Cloud storage. Now, whether we're talking about Stiva or we're talking about Thunder Hockey, most video analysis software that hockey teams use will have a cloud storage component to it. And the goal of that is you clip a game and then you can share it with coaching staff, you can share it with players, you can build movies. What actually I like to use is simple and the free tool, which is YouTube. And the reason for that is because, first of all, it's free, so that's nice. You don't have a ton of budget. But second, YouTube is built so that it works anytime, anywhere, on any kind of device. The only trade-off I see there is that you have to set up an account and make the videos private, and also you lose some quality. But otherwise, I see no real downside to using YouTube as kind of the go-to video solution. Content organization and sharing, and this is something that I don't think anybody in hockey has ever talked about, but I use a tool called Trello, and actually Trello is really neat. I'm going to show you this right now. So this is Trello. Okay. So it's a freemium collaboration project management software, and in any case, it's just a wall of post-it notes. So what you have there is you have a bunch of different categories. So you see here, this I have game reports which I prepare. There's a raw data that I can save there. There's some cumulative stuff and then other stuff. I've kind of blocked all these out because I don't want you guys to know what I'm doing. Hope you guys can respect that. And the point of this is that this is much better than email because it's just nicer to sort information that way, and then the coaches can go back any time. I've had the privilege of traveling with NHL teams on their charter, and so imagine if the game ends at 10:30, everybody goes back onto the plane. It's like 11:30, wheels go up. Players are sleeping or they're eating. The media members are just kind of having a glass of wine and chilling out. Same thing with like the equipment staff or the marketing staff. And then you have the coaches at the front of the plane who are looking at game video or at stats, and it could be like 12:30 at night, and they're still looking at it. And I have a problem with it personally because I don't think anybody does their best work at 12:30 after a 12-hour day. But when you put it on a platform like Trello, it just means that the coach can self-serve at any moment. So he can wake up at 4 a.m. with an idea and go back and check if it makes sense to him. And I know for a fact that that's how our coaches use it. So they don't have to give me a call or send me an email to say, where's that report from 6 months ago? You can just go and get it, which is great. So this is another section. And another thing that I use Trello for is to organize clips from outside sources. Now you can see this because these are all links to YouTube videos. These are, and I didn't make these videos, but they're just links to the goals and assist compilations for a lot of the top players in the NHL. And often what we would do is we would just share with our players to find out what the best guys in the world are doing and what they can do to play a little bit more like them. And Trello is a really nice environment to store that data in because once again, you can email things back and forth, but this is just here, and you can go and serve yourself. The next thing is communication ideation, and kind of something that gets glossed over a lot when you move from working for fun to public sphere and working for money for a team is that you lose a lot of the ability to ideate or to collaborate. Okay, and let's say that I'm doing something that's public and I'm thinking of something that Micah did a year ago. I can just send him a quick tweet saying, "Hey, Micah, can you send me that thing?" Or just remind me of what you were talking about. If you work for a team, well, in my case, I'm by myself, so if I forgot what I did last year, I'm screwed because who am I going to ask, right? And so that's kind of one side of it. And the other side is, hockey is a game. It's supposed to be fun to work in hockey. And I think there's a lot of value in bringing together people from different backgrounds, like the coaching staff, the management, the stats guys, even the strength and conditioning staff, the equipment staff, the scouts, and just have them kind of shoot the shit in kind of like a very informal environment. I think Slack is great for that. So that's something that definitely teams should look into. For an example, I've been contributing to hockey graphs, and this is, I've kind of blocked this out for our mutual protection here, but we have different channels where the talk can go from very technical to just, we can talk about food or anything else or who we don't like. And I think that's great because, first of all, it's fun, but second, it's a great jumping off point for future projects because we're not actively thinking about what we want to do, but it's always in the back of our minds. And because we're, smart people and we're like-minded, you're going to have the occasional creativity spark, and we can go from there. Okay. I'm actually running under, which is great. So final thoughts. The main idea here is, I'm not using maybe the best tools. They're certainly the cheapest tools, but you got to have a structure. Right? You can't just create knowledge and then trying to cram it into some coach's brain, and then if he's not immediately receptive, that knowledge gets lost. You have to create a structure where that knowledge gets stored and can be used in the future. Right? I was on the ice recently with our goalie coach, and I did a bunch of goalie tracking things last season, which I sent to her, but I don't think she ever looked at it. But all of a sudden, she was fascinated about everything I did because she was meeting with the goalie coach of an NHL team, and then they were going to kind of touch on that. So you never know when things are going to come in handy. So it's really useful to have a structure and some tools to support that. Second of all, keep it simple because, what's the point? If we're smart enough to create complex things, then we're smart enough also to kind of simplify it back down. And also for me, since I'm the only person on the team who does this, generally speaking, I'll take something, I'll run with it, and then I'll try to sell it later to the coaching staff. Because if I'm trying to get permission on something or buy-in on something that doesn't exist yet, and I don't even know what I'm going to do, then it's very tough to get anything moved. So I just say, do it first, and then try to communicate with it. That's it.
All right, so our next speaker is Stefan Wolejszo. Stefan is currently working as a social scientist for the government of Canada. We'd like you to know that all views expressed here are, of course, his own. He began writing about hockey, focusing on a year-long integrating hockey analysis project. He's currently writing at the site In Stories Numbers Tell.
Yeah. Okay, sorry for the delay. Had to get this all organized. So for my talk, I'm going to talk about, start off by just quickly going through the different types of hockey information out there. Why is integration important? Which comes back to, in my mind, 3 disconnects that occur now. And then I'll talk about the data integration continuum and different ways of putting data together, and then with some recommendations and conclusions. So for the types of hockey information we have the directly known stuff that we could get from War on Ice generally, or sites like Stats.Hockey Stats. That's the top left. There's tracking projects like Zone Entry Project and things of that nature, passing projects that people do on their own. So the stuff on the left is kind of the hard data that we have that we can be pretty confident about. But then there's other types of hockey information that are possible that we don't use as a general rule. On the top right corner, there's information that we get from teams that's mediated through the media, through newspaper stories. This player has a lot of heart, this player has determination, et cetera, et cetera. The reason we don't use them is we can't trust it. Teams may be intentionally sending out messages if they're trying to unload a bad hockey player, for example, and they might build them up in the media as something that he's not. And then in the bottom right corner, we have proprietary data. Teams will have scouting reports with a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. There's informal evaluations done by assistant coaches, AGM. Like there's all sorts of evaluations continually going on. And then there's work done by team analysts and consultants and sport consulting firms. Catapult was in the news recently because Toronto Maple Leafs hired them on, so that makes it newsworthy automatically. So we have, on the right-hand side, we have kind of information that's out there. It comes to us in an imperfect form, or it doesn't come to us at all. So when you look at the big picture, we have stuff that's known, and everything on the right is kind of the black box of things that are possible, but we don't have access to. So why do we integrate, or why would we integrate? Current analytics provides a partial picture. There's focus on available data. Largely what we have are data that comes to us that's scraped from like NHL.com or something, or through tracking projects. And the research that happens in the analytics community is that people take this data, they try to refine the measures. So we have like BQRC, WOWI, SPAR. We have tracking, we have applying measures. So we take it and say, well, this player is better than that player, or here's how we can evaluate goaltenders or something to that effect. And then there's the tracking projects, of course. And in my mind, I see three important disconnects here. One relating to information, one on emphasis, and one on integration. Now, if a person is hired by a team, and that's the goal of a lot of people probably in this room, to eventually be hired by a club, you have access to different information. So you've built up your reputation, you've done solid work in a blog or writing for a website, and you're used to using data from Wolejszo or one of the other sites, but all of a sudden you have, say you're hired by Buffalo, and you have data reports coming in. Tim Murray said that he asked all of his scouts converting to where they use, excuse me, like a 5+ at the top of the scale. So what do you do with that? And also, along with having access to more and different types of information, you may be asked specific questions by a coach. So are you going to be able to answer a specific question with limited amounts of data, like limited amounts of information out there that you may not be able to easily quantify? So there's also the issue of silos, where, and Jack touched on this also, if you're hired by a team, you're kind of closed off, you can't share information easily. So if you run into issues, it's very hard to get outside help. You have to be very discreet and subtle about it. And there's also a part of this is that there's a zero-sum game involved, and there's a focus on proprietary information by teams. What I mean by this is you get better at the expense of other teams. Basically, if everyone has the exact same information, they're using all the same metrics, there's no advantage to your team anymore. Like those metrics no longer have the same amount of value. So teams tend to focus on this proprietary data because they see it as something that gives them an edge. Whether it's real or imagined, that's a separate question. Now, for different emphasis, in the online analytics community in particular, there's a lot of talk, especially around UFA signing day, which is like Christmas and analytics. There's a lot of talk about, well, they signed this player who has a 49% percentage over this player who has 52%. Oh my God, I can't believe how awful those people are. They're crazy. But when you're looking at it from an organizational perspective, you have 45 to 50 typically contracts in the organization. And so player development takes on a larger role. Like, let's maximize how good all of those players can get, understanding that not everyone has the same potential, of course, but let's get players to be as good as possible, generating a positive team culture, because all these players have to interact continually and they have to build something that works. So you have, you know, a very different emphasis. And the results that you get are only as good as the integration that you do. And I think this is kind of the most important point. When a general manager is making decisions, they're getting information from coaches, assistant general managers, ownership sometimes, analysts, contractors. And the question is, well, where does analytics and stuff that we're doing and talking about here fit into this bigger question? And there's some, you know, release the potential of unhappiness when an analyst is ignored. It's like, well, this team hired the best analyst out there, and they signed this slug to a 5 times $5 million a year deal. Like, what's going on here? So there seems to be a disconnect there as well. And so right now, what we have is a situation where all of the integration, all of this different types of information is being put together at the highest level. And this is, you get it to work. Yeah, this is how they currently put the information. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. So this is the process that teams usually use to put all this information, a pretty good estimation of it, in my view. I think we can improve on this. Oops. That's awesome. Okay. So when we talk about integration, a lot of the work comes out that I'm familiar with. I'm a social scientist, by the way, so there is a particular slant here. It comes out of mixed methods research. I didn't create this myself. This is repeated again and again. I call it the Kinsey scale of methodology. Basically, on one end, on the far left, you have people who come from the pure qualitative perspective. That's the watch the game nerds crowd, for example. That's where they would fit. On the far right, you have the pure quantitative crowd. And those are the individuals who are, they sign that player because he's good in a room, LOL on Twitter crowd. So they don't want to hear about anything except for the numbers. And that's how they base all the thought processes and their evaluations. But in between, there's qualitative mix, quantitative mix, and full integration as possibilities. Now, qualitative mixed is, you have qualitative measures, qualitative analysis, a lot of judgment involved, and then the metrics are brought in to double check and confirm. I call it the drunken lampposts type of analysis, borrowing from Brian Burke's famous quote about how analytics is like a lamppost to a drunk. You've all probably read that one. Now, this is likely the most common approach that's used in the National Hockey League by teams today. And for each of these things, there's some hard questions. For this one, the hard questions are GMs likely to have expertise in qualitative analysis? And I think that a lot of times there's some confusion in the community where, where a qualitative approach is viewed as being poor because of some of the stuff that's said by teams, but the GMs who are doing this analysis may not have any expertise. It may not be the fact that it's qualitative. It may not be the types of variables that they're talking about. It may just be that the GM is kind of doesn't have any knowledge of how to put all this stuff together effectively. Now, quantitative mixed is, some people in this room are probably in this category where you want to use quantitative analysis as much as possible, but you're willing to say, you know, maybe this player is kind of toxic, you know, it may not be a good idea to sign this guy, there's some red flags here, even though the numbers are good. So if you kind of agree with that and you're nodding your head, then this is probably the category that you're in. And the hard question here is, are all of the most important components quantified? And so this type of approach is only as good as how broad your results are, how many things you're taking into account, and how well they predict what you want to predict. Now, full integration, which is kind of what I advocate, is basically not favoring qualitative or quantitative, and there's different ways of doing it. The first one I'm just going to mention, you could use a complex systems approach like the behavioral engineering model. And this leaves qualitative data as qualitative, quantitative data as quantitative, and it brings them both together into single analysis. That would be a whole larger presentation to try to explain how that works, so we're going to leave that one aside. But for purposes of this presentation, one good approach is to basically quantify everything. But this is where you build models that are a mix of latent and manifest variables. Manifest variables are things that you directly measure. Latent variables would be things like determination, leadership, things that you measure indirectly. So you see the effects, you measure those effects, you put them together, you say this is what's causing it, and you have a measure, you have a number that you can actually use. And so I want to give you an example to show you what this type of approach looks like. This is more on the theoretical side for what I do, because I don't actually have the data for all of this stuff, is I pour through journals. I spend a lot of my time doing that. And I say, well, okay, when we approach questions like, what's the relationship between you know, psychological factors and injuries? And then I look at what's done in research that's done in academia and stuff like that. And that way, you know, hopefully if we have the data down the road, then it could be applied in an NHL context. So here's an example. I don't want to lose the forest for the trees here. This research was done in Europe, and it was done on non-professional athletes who are performing after work, who are playing games after work. And it looked at the effects of cognitive fatigue, workload, and conscientiousness on risky behavior and then injury. And what they found here was that working a lot in the daytime may not have a direct effect on the amount of injuries that people have. But your workload, if you put it through cognitive fatigue as a mediator, and then it will lead to risky behaviors, which will in turn lead to more injuries. And that's exactly what was happening. So this is an amateur setting. Again, I don't want to lose the forest for the trees and pretend that this applies directly to the NHL context. But if I had access to an NHL team and access to all the players, I would look at this. I would say, well, let's try to measure this and see if this works. So in terms of reconnecting then, for those three disconnects that I talk about, for the fact that there's different information available, I think we have to be conscious that right now in the analytics community, when we're doing our posts and analysis, we are creating what analytics is to an extent. Teams are going to look at it as they're selecting, you know, people who might be good to work for them, and they're going to expect you to do what you're doing to a degree. So if you're limiting what you're doing now, when a team hires you on, your job might be equally limited once you get there. I think that it's important at this stage in analytics to look at research in other areas. Even if we don't have the data right now, say, well, what are they talking about in leadership? Like in leadership literature, if you go into EBSCO, you have university access, there's over 2,200 quantitative articles on leadership. There's types of leadership. There's a discussion about whether leadership is an individual trait or a process. That's where we're at right now in the discussion, but none of that is appearing anywhere right now in analytics. And track teams are hiring. In the last article that referenced Brian Burke, the one where he famously talked about how we hired the best analytics person we don't like to brag about it. Remember that quote? Which is awesome. By the way, he's the biggest troll out there. I love it. But he also mentioned that he hired a sports therapist. So if you can gather psychometric information and say, well, wait a second, you've got a sports therapist, I can collect some information for you, let's put these different things together, let's talk to the trainers, then you can have this bigger reach once you're hired than just being the guy or the girl or the lady who runs numbers for a team. Like, you can do a lot more. Now, for the disconnect of different goals, right now we're really good in analytics with improving player selection. That's where a lot of the emphasis is. Player development, team culture, personal dynamics, things of that nature. Probably not so good idea in my estimation to really improve those areas. Again, even if we don't have the data, at least be talking about it and seeing what the research is showing in other fields or in other sports sometimes. And speaking the same language as team management always helps. If we're, the way we look at it, if it doesn't mesh with the people who make final decisions, it's going to be disregarded regardless of how good it is. It's a tree falling in the forest, is what it becomes. Now, integration right now is not stellar on teams. So my suggestion here is to hit as many areas as possible, provide an integrated and a holistic approach, interface with other staff, get used to the idea of picking up as many different types of analysis that's done in as many different types of fields as you possibly can that could apply. Don't be happy, in my view, with just repeating the same types of analysis that you continually see in hockey and analytics today. Do something different, stretch further. There's some good examples of it today in different talks where people were applying different approaches that could yield results. If you have even more data, you have even better results. So in conclusion, even the best analysis has little or no value if it is not integrated well. Analytics is in a process of defining itself, so I suggest define carefully and build your skill sets accordingly. Integrate whatever can be quantified. That's what most of us are going, the approach most of us are going to take. And if you come up with an integrated analysis, it's going to be a lot harder to ignore. If you just run some numbers for a team and present it, it's pretty easy for a general manager to just kind of push to the side or a coach to ignore it. But if you're talking about things and it's well integrated with the team psychologists, with the trainers, and it's in a language that they're using, then it's a lot harder for them to just brush it aside. So that's my
Okay, our final speaker of the day is coming over here, Michael Boutros. Michael is an economics graduate and a huge fan of hockey. He currently works as a research assistant at the Bank of Canada and can't wait for the Stanley Cup parade to make its way through downtown Toronto in mid-2016.
All right, so it's been a very long day. We're kind of nearing the end. I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. I should probably preface by saying that obviously these are my views, not represented by the Bank of Canada. Which the bank does not have a view. The compliance told me how to say it. So we've had a lot of super interesting talks today, and a lot of them have been kind of on the micro level, looking at individual players, and I think that's very valuable. But what I did in this paper is I kind of took more of a macro approach. So I want to see, does the way a team is formed affect their performance? So I'm going to approach that kind of from an economics perspective, and I hope that you guys find it interesting. So over the past few years, there's been a ton of diversity in the NHL. So first season, 1916-17, 3 countries represented: Canada, the US, and Great Britain. By 74-75, there were almost 20 countries, and in 2012-2013, at one point or another, there have been players from 42 different countries, which is pretty impressive, right? NHL brings people together. A lot of us share from different places. I'm from Egypt, and I love hockey, so it's kind of crazy how we can, all this cool stuff brings people together. So the question that I was thinking was, does there exist a positive chemistry effect on teams with more players from the same country? So I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to propose a quantitative framework without saying anything about the results, and then I'm going to take it one step further, and I am going to say something about the results. So what I do to measure team diversity is I use something called fractionality. This is a very old and existing measure in economics literature, talking about within a firm, there are people from different classifications of education, income, gender, family status, all that kind of stuff. So I'm taking it here and I'm turning it into nationality. So I calculate S for each nationality N on team I. Basically, S is the fraction of the total number of games played by all players on a team that is attributed to that nationality. So we're weighting the nationality by number of games played. So if you have a caller from the AHL who's going to play a couple of games, their nationality won't be weighted as heavily as someone who played the whole season. Using all of those shares of nationalities, we can calculate fractionality. So this is the measure of fractionality, you can see it there. It basically implies that a higher fractionality means more diversity on a team, and my hypothesis is that that should lead to less chemistry. So some quick facts before I show some examples are, fractionality is minimized if all players are from the same country. So if every single player on the team is Canadian, the SN for Canada will be 1. So SN squared is 1. 1 minus 1 equals 0. If all the dress players or every single player on the team is from different countries, that's the way you're going to get the highest fractionality possible. As the number of nationalities increases, F increases. So if you add one new player from a new country, fractionality will increase. And for any given number of nationalities, F is highest when each nationality has an even amount. And as it gets more uneven, it approaches the state where one nationality is the highest. And you can imagine where there's one nationality that has 99%, all the others have almost 0, and you're back at a state where fractionality is minimized. Some examples. So the very first example is the simplest one. If you have one nationality and the share is 1, you get 0 fractionality. If you have 3 nationalities, you can see that I gave 2 examples. And one with 3 even shares, fractionality is about 2/3. But in the case where one nationality represents half the team and the other 2 are each 1/4, it's down to 0.625. 0.625 is about the sample mean for fractionalities. And you can see it's not that hard to achieve. So 09 Ducks did it with 6 nationalities, and the 2007 Boston Bruins did it with 7 nationalities. And most of the teams that I'll talk about a little bit later, the data, they end up around the 0.6 to 0.65 range for fractionality. Can fractionality change? We're talking about something like this, and if there's no change over this sample period, then there's not going to be any results. So I highlighted the Boston Bruins for no good reason other than it's kind of a good example. You can see from 05 to 2014, the mean was 0.581, but there's a pretty high standard deviation. If you split that into 05 to 09, and then 09 to 2014, you can see there's some kind of structural shift right there in the middle, right? So in the beginning, right, 0.648 with a low standard deviation, and after 09 to 2014, 0.51 with 0.028 standard deviation, also very small. What caused this? So in 09-10, there were 6 nationalities, and Canadians formed 58% of the team. In the very next year, it was still 6 nationalities. Canadians jumped up to forming 67% of the team. There was a change of 0.11 in fractionality, completely unintentionally on behalf of the general manager, in just one season. There's a typo on the slide there. Those numbers don't add up, so it doesn't make sense. But what happened was there were 160 more Canadian played games and 162 less non-Canadian. So there's a 2-game difference just because of call-ups and all that kind of stuff. And the biggest changes were Marco Sturm, who was German, he left the team. Nathan Horton came on, he joined the team, and he was a Canadian. So it wasn't the general manager thinking, I need more Canadians, I need more Germans. One contract expired and the player wasn't playing that well, he moved away. They grabbed another player who was doing really well. Some other notable changes. So I picked the top 3 changes and the bottom 3 changes. So these are not really exemplary of the sample, but there's some pretty big movements that we can see. And the most interesting thing on the slide is you can see Tampa Bay had the 3rd highest negative change in 2011-12, and the very next year they jumped back up, right? So you can see how even in 1 year, if there's some restructuring of the team, completely intentionally, especially of the more key players, fractionality can jump quite a bit. And that's important because we want to see variation to match the varying performance. If there's no variation in this, then we can't say anything happens because of this. So the data was constructed, it's kind of a novel data set. And if anyone would like to use it, just send me an email. My name is spelled a little bit wrong on the program. It's B-O-U-T-R-O-S, so michael.boutros@gmail.com. I got data for all 30 teams, but I excluded the Jets and the Thrashers because there was the team movement, which kind of ruins some of the analysis I want to do. I'll talk about that in a bit. But I got a bunch of data and I matched it all together. So I have this sample that matches GMs to coaches to teams to performance for the team and individual players, which aggregate up to the team level. So the model. This slide might be a little bit scary, but bear with me. I'm going to try to explain it as well as I can. This beautiful equation here that was a product of many hours of work basically says that performance is a function of the following things. Fractionality, which is the diversity measure that we just talked about. Some controls, which we'll talk about in a bit, general manager effects, team effects, and a random shock. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take performance in a variety of ways. As overall points percentage to accommodate for the fact that there was a shortened season, so using percentage kind of mitigates that because the percentage is the same. I'm going to look at offensive measures, defensive measures, and then the advanced stats, which is Corsi and Fenwick against and for. What I do is I use a fixed effects model with team GM panels. So a fixed effects model, what that'll do is that if you look at the first Greek symbol, the zeta, that's indexed to year I, GM, and T for team. We don't observe that. There's no good way to measure the GM's effects. But if we believe that between years, the GM's effects are constant, if I take the average over all the team GM panels and subtract it away, then the average of a number that never changes is that number itself. So in that way, I remove the fixed effect of having this general manager. So some examples, a general manager might be better at negotiating contracts. A general manager might be nicer to players or nicer to his coach, and therefore the coach does better or whatever reason. Same thing for the team. A team fixed effect could be in Toronto. Everyone says, oh, the media there is so bad, it affects their performance. So things like that, you can't really measure them. But when you use a fixed effect sample, if you have enough data like I do here, you can try to get rid of some of those constant effects without directly observing. Now, the reason I chose a team GM panel is because when you think of roster, you don't think of the coach and you don't think of the team, you think of the GM. The GM is largely responsible for forming the roster, and then the coach kind of takes that as given. And the president, I don't think they have too much input about that other than how much it was going to cost them. So the controls I talked about are very, very important. Because in that previous slide, if I don't control for the fact that some players are just good, I'm going to mix up my results. Am I attributing the success to the fact that the team is good or to the fact that they're all from different countries? So I need some controls. Now, the controls are actually pretty complicated due to the way that we're structuring the model. I won't talk about it too much, but if anyone wants to read the whole paper, then you're more than welcome. The main condition is that the control can't be directly related to any of the performance measures. So you think one good control is how many goals were scored. But if goals scored relies on fractionality, and we're saying that that's going to be a control, when we estimate the model, where's that effect going to go? Is it going to go on the constant for fractionality or on the constant for the goals or the control? So we have to make sure that those two things aren't related. So what I come up with is 3 controls for skill that are largely imperfect, but you'll see that using all 3 of them really helps the estimation. The first, average draft position of drafted players. The majority of players are drafted. We all know some big names who weren't drafted, but for those players, they're excluded, but overall, average draft of all players on a team who are drafted. The next 2 are 2 averages on the previous Team GM panel. So when you look at the previous Team GM panel, it gets rid of that effect of, is this performance coming from the fractionality or from the fact that this player is good? If you're looking at the player on their last team, then this team's fractionality shouldn't affect it. So the 2 controls are largely imperfect again, but what they do is look at the share of season total points on previous Team GM combinations, which is good because it shows you how good you are related to other players that year, but it's bad because if you had an injury or if you didn't play on a very good team that didn't score much, you'd have less points. The third control looks at average players' points per game, which should get rid of the fact that you could have been injured or you're on a bad team, but what it does is it might inflate some players if they played with really good teammates. So the 2 together kind of get at the pure skill, as well as the draft, which is largely imperfect, but I think it does a pretty good job. Our first regression, we look at overall results. So in the first column, I run the model vanilla. There are no controls and no fixed effects, but we already see that the sign on the coefficient, so where it says fractionality right next to it, it says negative 0.075. The sign is what we'd expect. So it kind of shows you that, well, as you get higher fractionality, your points percentage drops. But the estimate is not statistically significant. So that means that if we were to run this with another sample, it's highly likely we get a completely different number, and therefore we can't use this result. We just don't trust it. In the second column, we add the controls, the 3 controls I just mentioned, and our result is weaker, but we have some significance. So adding the controls kind of removes some noise from our tests and narrows down our estimate a little bit better. But you can see in the final column that when we add the fixed effects as well, 2 good things happen. A, our estimate gets higher, which is our hypothesis. That's kind of what I think should happen. And B, from the statistical sense, the estimate gets even more significant. So it's 2 stars, which correlates to a p-value of less than 0.05. So we're saying that with using controls and fixed effects, the number is pinned down pretty well. As you can see, the R-squareds are not high. They're not high, and I didn't omit them on purpose. What I'm saying here is that fractionality is important, but it's not the whole story. And these R-squareds and these kind of macro tests usually do that. On a macro level, you can try to pinpoint what's important, but you can't say this is going to attribute to a significant change in your performance. What do these numbers mean? So the number I'm going to use is negative 0.134. A 0.25 decrease in fractionality means a 3.35 percentage points increase in points percentage. That might seem very small, but I looked it up, and in every single season from 2013-14 going back to 03-04, at least one team in the East or Western Conference would have moved into the final playoff position with that increase. So that's not insignificant. If you're in the NHL, the highest caliber hockey league in the world, you're looking for that minute advantage. You're looking for any way to move yourself up into the playoffs. And you know, it's not completely unreasonable to look for a 0.25% decrease. In our sample, we saw one team almost hit that number unintentionally. So if you're focusing on it and if you're trying to do it, it's definitely something you can do in one off season, if not 2 off seasons. Looking specifically at offense, again, I'm going to ignore the first and third columns because they're not significant. Those numbers, I can't trust them at all. They're just not, the stats say don't trust these numbers. The second and fourth columns, however, are significant. And again, for some perspective, that number, negative 5.47, says that with a 10% shooting percentage, which is pretty standard for what I've been reading, that's what people like to use, decreasing fractionality by 0.5 means scoring 26 more goals. In 2013-14, first and 7th place overall in total goals scored, that's the difference between them. Now, if this is a little bit unreasonable, 0.5, okay, I'll give you that. If you go to 0.125, which is 1/4, you'd score about 6 more goals, which is the difference between 1 and 3 in terms of goals scored in 2013-14. So again, these are not huge differences, but when it gets to the very top of the scale, the top end of the spectrum, those tiny, tiny differences can really help a team out. So I think that it's small, but it's small enough in such a tight league that it'll get to the next level. Now, something that we alluded to all day is that we're just not good at measuring defense, and I can totally say that my paper does not measure defense well either. When I try to regress on these 3 defensive measures, 2 things happen. A, my statistical measures are extremely insignificant. Like, these are terribly insignificant, and the coefficients are the wrong sign. So it's saying that as fractionality gets, as there's more chemistry, you're actually worse at defense. So I'll talk about that more in a second, but it kind of corroborates the story that maybe we're just looking at the wrong things for defense. But it could also mean that even if you have chemistry, defense is more of a one-on-one thing. You're not looking for chemistry when you're trying to break up a breakaway. You're trying to look for chemistry when you're on the breakaway and you want to look at your partner. Are you going to shoot? Are you going to pass? So that could be one story, or it could be we just don't have good measures for it. The final regression I did was on advanced statistics. And again, advanced, Corsi and Fenwick against before. And we see the same results. So for the 2 offensive measures in columns 1 and 3, there's a significant result. So it goes in the direction we think. And if you remember back to the shots, it was about -5. This is a little bit stronger, as you'd expect, because these are basically measures of shots with more things added in, like block shots, posts, goals, all that kind of stuff. So again, here the question becomes, why can't we pick up anything on the defensive side? Is it a problem with measurement, or is it a problem of it just doesn't exist? So I promise to keep it short, and I kind of sped through it, but my 4 conclusions coming from this are the following. Fractionality is in fact important for overall team performance, but GMs are largely unaware of this. They might have an idea in their heads, but they're not actively trying to pursue this line of thought. Lower fractionality is correlated with higher offense and advanced possession metrics. So I use the word correlated there. So that word can be traded in with lower fractionality causes better performance if you believe the model is correct. You can trade those in, and I'll leave it up to you guys. In the paper that I wrote, I very strongly emphasize the model and the assumptions required to make it true. And it boils down to the fact that I do think the model is true, and we can show a causal relationship between those 2 things. But at least, just looking at the numbers, there's definitely a correlation. There's nothing to say regarding defensive metrics. We might need a better model, or there might not be anything to say. My final thoughts are next steps. So I chose to diversify along nationality. When you think about it, does it really matter where I was born, or does it matter where I played? So if you have a Canadian who played in the KHL for 4 years, coming back to play in the NHL, is he going to play better with Canadians or with the Russians who played in the KHL? And the other way works. So you can look at it along many, many different dimensions. And if there's anyone who has any suggestions or wants to take the data and do things with it, then I'm more than happy to share that. Thank you.
Stefan, Jeff, you guys, well, Jack, you're already on here. Stefan, if you want to come down over here, we're going to do a couple of quick questions before we wrap up here. Nope.
Hi, this question for Michael.
Hi.
Have you? This is only a small-ish shift from country of origin. Do you have the data just to look at language fluency?
Pardon me, sorry, what was?
You look at language fluency.
Language fluency.
And fractionalize along that. It would be tricky because some people speak multiple languages. Yeah, but could you define a more subtle fractionalization measure that would take that into account?
Definitely. So that could
a possible mechanism in mind that people who can't understand one another don't practice properly, etc.
That's a very good point. And so that was one thing. And there was another point raised earlier when I was talking to someone looking at your junior league, right? Because if you're Canadian or American, you're probably playing the Canadian junior system or the American junior system. And my response to that is that is definitely a place where you can look. But I would imagine there's a high degree of correlation between your fluency and where you were born, right? So it could definitely take the results and make them more significant or kind of pin them down a little bit better. But I think it would be largely the same. But you guys are the experts, right? So if there's a data set that kind of talks about that, then it would be definitely very interesting. So one thing that I could do just really simply is I looked at continents. Because from countries, you can map the continents very easily, and along continents, there's nothing. So that's, it's not too surprising because there's only 7 continents, and I think 3 of them are represented in the sample. But you could definitely look along many, many angles, anything that you have data for on an individual player basis.
Comments, insults?
Yeah.
So I want to tie Michael's topic to Stefan's general thinking about these things. You identified something like a chemistry aspect. Now you go to the coach. What's the first question you ask the coach as to why you think this is playing into this for a particular team? Either of you can answer. I'm just generally curious what the next step is if someone wants to weaponize this.
I'll let Stefan answer about the weaponizing part because I need to drive back to Canada soon. But I tried to look at the same analysis, looking at a team GM coach panel. But at present, there isn't enough good data going back because if you're separated into the coach, the eras are too short and you can't do the fixed effects. So that's definitely something like this kind of analysis and everything that we're doing. As more years go on and there's more data, we can definitely do more stuff. But I'll pass it on to Stefan now.
In terms of what I do, I think that the best way to sell it is to say hockey is not a whole bunch of separate things. We have training tying into performance, tying in, like there's all sorts of things that are interconnected together. And so rather than looking at them as different things, where something might be missed along the way, tying everything together as a general approach, a general philosophy toward analyzing the team, the goals, how our player evaluation, putting it all together as a single unit makes the most sense. That way we're not segregating and losing things.
Okay, well, thank you guys.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, right here.
Question for Michael. I was wondering if GM of a team came to you and asked for advice based on what you learned in your research, what would you tell them? Like, would you tell them that basically you're better off trying to have players come from the same country, or what would you tell them?
What I would tell them is that gut feeling you get that 2 players who grew up together or played together in the KHL or the AHL, although we can't pinpoint it directly, it's true. The numbers back up your gut feeling to a certain extent. And I think that's something GMs want to hear. I have this gut feeling. Is it because I had a big lunch, or is it because something is actually there that I can't exactly quantify? So when you do this kind of macro stuff, these numbers are, for the large part, approximations. We can't pinpoint it exactly, but it's there and it's far enough away from 0 that it's not 0. So I would tell them that when it's coming down to 2 players, you got to pick one more for your roster. One of them is coming from the KHL, he's really good. One of them is coming from the AHL, he has some experience with some of the other guys in the team. I would take him over the other guy because there is something he can provide because he's a big guy.
I have a question for Zach. You talked a lot about a lot of the different tools that you use to get across to your coaches and management. Obviously, management is often not technologically literate, or as literate as could be possible. So how do you get to them to buy into the thing at first to introduce them to a whole new platform for doing things? Like how do you introduce them to it?
Okay, so just to give you a bit of context, the head coach I work with, his name is Peter Schmidt, and he's about, I don't want to go over it, but he's about 60 years old, okay? And I mean, he coached at the Olympic level, very smart guy, has a master's degree in education, but mostly, you know, he's of a certain age. And so what we did last year was mostly, like, I would go and do stuff, right? And then I'd come back to him and I'd say, play her more, play her less, and then don't play her with her. Like that was the extent of our conversation, right? Going back to the whole like 110 and 1. This year, I think he's gotten a little bit more hands-on with using Trello and asking me for stuff. But mostly that's it. Like for me, I think it's the less time I spent with him talking about this kind of things, the better it is. Right? Like I don't want to overload him, just like I don't want him to overload our players. Like recently in a pregame meeting, he talked about some of the work I've been doing, and like I had my hand on my face the whole time because I'm like why are you talking about this? It's playing 2 hours. We don't want them thinking about this. But we played a good game, so maybe there's something to it. But it's a process. Like for me, like less is more. That's it.
Okay, my questions for Michael. How do you think like players with a double nationality or things like that could affect that that aspect of the data? Let's say Paul Stachy is born in Quebec City, but he's American. Bill is born in the Red City, but he's American. He has dual citizenship. Or a guy like Danny Cleveland, which was born in Germany, but is Canadian. So what do you think about that? How that would affect that?
So the first thing with that is I didn't want to touch that problem with the 10-foot pole. So I left it. It was very important to me to find a source that did that work for me, so I could talk to them. I don't know how they coded it, why they coded it the way they did, but whatever mechanism they did for dual citizenship players, that's what I'm going with. To your point, it could definitely be a factor. I could definitely foresee a situation where they have the dual citizenship. Maybe they've always lived in country A, but they identify as country B because they want to play for that country's team in the Olympics. It happens all the time, right? So what I would say is that I don't think it happens enough. They would have a significant result. It could definitely have some effect at the margins. From my understanding, it does happen. Doesn't happen enough that it'll significantly affect my results.
Actually, tout se fait Québec, hein? Okay. So the whole time Michael was talking, the thing that was popping in my head is like I'm from Montreal. I grew up in Montreal, and I learned to play hockey with French-speaking coaches. So for me, like I would definitely split English and French Canada. That's like the most obvious thing for me. So that's something
and that's beautiful. You can definitely split along language.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much, guys. Appreciate it.
What?
I've got the quick question.
This is for everybody here. Just could we thank Ryan and Matt for putting this together? And the next question is, where's the bar?
Oh, we're trying to get there, Vicky.
I wanted to make it a question.
All right, so one more round of hand for these three. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so real quick, I just want to take a second. I know some of you have traveled very far. It's been great. You all could be here. I really appreciate all of your time. Everyone coming here and making this possible. If you guys didn't, nobody agreed to come, we wouldn't do this. So, just thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This was great. I hope we can do it again sometime. I do a couple announcements. One is we bought way too much food, and so there's, especially if there are students here and there are pizzas left over. If anyone's traveling, there's pizza, there's bagels, I think there's cookies. It's out there. Please take it. Some of them get thrown away if you don't take it. So please do that.
I remember my college years, like free food was like currency or everything. So.
Yeah. So that was one thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, for those of us that are coming out tonight, we're going same place we were last night. It's McGregor's Grill and Tap Room. If you have a GPS, the address is 300 Jefferson Road, or the town of Henrietta. Make it easy for you.
And it's right, just right outside campus, like pretty much almost catty corner from the Barnes & Noble that you probably saw when you were coming in.
Or you can just follow some.
Yeah, and also I think there's a handful of people going, so if you don't
have, if you're looking for a ride, you could, I have room in my car too, so. But yeah, I'm thirsty. Can we go? Thank you, everyone.
Get my slide. About the